Christmas comes to Victorian London wrapped in myth-snow soft streets, glowing windows, voices raised in carol. But step one street deeper, and the illusion collapses. Here, snow does not sparkle. It hardens, it sinks into mud, already black with sewage and coal dust. The air burns the lungs, walls sweat damp. In rooms meant for one, 6 bodies lie pressed together for warmth, listening to hunger scrape inside their chests. For the poor, Christmas does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as another test of endurance. If you're here for these quieter, darker histories, pause for a moment, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. These stories are not told loudly. They survive only when someone chooses to stay and listen. In the Victorian slums, Christmas meant work without pause, sickness without mercy, and children waking to the same cold silence they fell asleep in. Charity was rare, uneven, and often humiliating. Joy existed, but only in brief, fragile flashes: a shared crust of bread, a borrowed flame, a song hummed to keep despair at bay. This is not the Christmas of cards and candles. This is the season as it was truly lived, stripped of sentiment, soaked in ether and smoke, and endured one breath at a time. Snow arrived in the slums without ceremony. It did not drift down softly, nor did it brighten the streets, as painters later imagined. It fell heavy and wet, clinging to brickwork already stained black by years of smoke. It gathered in ruts carved by carts, in corners where refuse lay half buried, and along the thresholds of houses that were never meant to keep winter out. By nightfall, it froze into a dull crust, trapping filth beneath a skin of white that fooled no one who lived there. In wealthier quarters, snow was admired from behind glass. In the slums, it was felt immediately through thin boots, through cracked soles, through floorboards that separated families from the earth by little more than habit. It crept upward from the ground, biting ankles, stiffening fingers, turning breath into visible proof of how poorly the body was protected. Children learned quickly that snow meant pain. They stamped their feet not in play, but in instinct, trying to coax life back into numbed toes. Christmas week only sharpened its presence. Coal was dearer in winter, and scarcer still when wages vanished into rent. Many hearths went cold long before the holiday arrived. Fires, when they burned at all, were kept low and rationed, fed scraps at a time, their warmth hovering uselessly near the ceiling while the floor remained a slab of ice. The smell of damp wool and unwashed skin thickened as windows stayed shut, sealing families inside rooms that breathed poorly and remembered everything. The snow carried sound differently. Footsteps echoed longer in narrow courts. Coughs travelled through walls as if they belonged to everyone at once. Somewhere nearby, a child cried, not loudly, but persistently, the thin sound of discomfort that had learned shouting achieved nothing. In these streets, winter was not dramatic. It was constant. It pressed inward, patient and unrelenting. Outside, the city performed Christmas for those who could afford to witness it. Shop windows glowed in distant thoroughfares. Bells rang from churches whose doors opened only briefly for the poor, just long enough to remind them where warmth was not. Carols floated on the air, losing strength as they crossed into poorer districts, thinning out like breath in the cold. By the time they reached the slums, they sounded altered, hollow, disconnected from the lives around them. Snow turned labor cruel. Those who worked outdoors did so with stiff hands and cracked skin, fingers wrapped in rags that quickly soaked through. Those indoors fared little better. Factories were drafty, workshops unheated, kitchens filled with steam that froze on contact with walls. Christmas did not excuse absence. Hunger did not pause. Illness spread faster in the cold, lungs weakened by damp and exhaustion, bodies already operating on narrow margins. For the very young and the very old, winter was a reckoning. Infants slept wrapped in layers that could not trap enough heat. The elderly sat close to dead fires, joints locked, breaths shallow. Death did not announce itself loudly in these weeks. It came quietly, often overnight, leaving behind rooms that felt no different for the loss. Snow lingered long after the novelty faded. It turned grey within hours, churned by feet and wheels, absorbing soot until it resembled ash more than ice. Children traced patterns in it with sticks, not from joy but from boredom and confinement. Mothers swept it from doorways, knowing it would return before evening. Fathers stepped into it before dawn, shoulders hunched, faces already resigned. This was the snow of Victorian Christmas in the slums, not a symbol, not a decoration, but a condition. It did not invite wonder, it demanded endurance. And it settled in early, reminding those who lived beneath it that winter, like poverty, did not care what day it was. Sound travelled strangely through the winter streets. Cold sharpened it, stretched it thin, carried it farther than it had any right to go. On Christmas Eve, voices rose from places the slums could not see: polished chapels, lamplit parlours, dining rooms where the air was warmed by bodies that had eaten well. Hymns drifted outward, lifted by the frost, gliding over rooftops and chimneys until they reached the darker quarters of the city. There, the songs arrived altered. A carol heard from the other side of the street was never whole. It reached the slums in fragments, a familiar refrain, a softened harmony, a phrase cut short by distance or stone. Walls swallowed the words. Alleys bent the sound until it no longer matched its meaning. What remained was not comfort, but contrast. It reminded those listening not of joy, but of where joy was being kept. Families paused when the singing passed by. Conversations thinned. A child looked up, confused by the sudden sweetness in the air. Mothers recognized the tune and turned away from it. Fathers pretended not to hear at all. The sound carried a weight heavier than silence, because it belonged to a world that refused to open its doors. Caroling parties sometimes ventured closer. Well-dressed figures moved along the edges of poorer districts, faces flushed with cold and cheer, voices raised with confidence. They sang earnestly, believing proximity itself was kindness. Yet they did not enter the courts where damp clung to brick like a disease. They did not step into passageways where the floor dipped with age and neglect. Their music hovered at the threshold, performing generosity without risking discomfort. Inside the slum rooms, reactions were uneven. Some listened in stillness, letting the sound wash over them as one might let snow fall through an open window briefly, without hope of warmth. Others resented it fiercely. A song about peace meant little when sleep came broken and shallow. Words about goodwill rang hollow when the following morning promised nothing but debt and cold. The carols did not lie, exactly. They simply did not apply. Children learned early that songs did not feed you. Still, they were drawn to them. A boy hummed a tune he barely knew, shaping nonsense syllables to fit a melody heard once and half remembered. His sister joined in, quieter, until their mother silenced them with a look not born of anger, but of caution. Music stirred feelings that could not be satisfied, and disappointment was dangerous in winter. Church bells followed the carols, heavy and deliberate. They marked time for those who could afford to notice it. In the slums, time was measured differently by how long the fire lasted, by how many hours until morning, by whether the coughing in the next room sounded worse than yesterday. Bells rang out over the rooftops, then faded, leaving the streets no changed by their passing. For some, the carols carried memory. Older residents recalled childhoods already spent in poverty, Christmases that blurred together into a single long season of want. Others remembered moments before descent: a better job, a warmer home, a table that once held more than bread. The songs stirred these memories like sediment, clouding what little calm winter allowed. As the night deepened, the music thinned. Carolers returned indoors, choirs dispersed. The final notes dissolved into the fog, leaving behind a heavier quiet than before. In the slums, doors remained shut, candles burned low, the city exhaled, and the poor were left with what they had always possessed: the absence of song and the endurance to outlast it. Christmas music was never meant for them, though it passed close enough to be cruel. It reminded them not of faith or fellowship, but of distance, a few yards of street, a thickness of wall, a difference of circumstance that no melody could cross. Gaslight made promises it could not keep. When evening fell over the slums, lamps flickered to life along the main streets, casting a pale amber glow that suggested comfort where none existed. From a distance, the light softened brick and soot, lending the illusion of safety, even festivity. But up close, the glow revealed only what daylight had already exposed: damp walls, uneven stones, faces drawn thin by cold and fatigue. Inside the tenements, gaslight did little more than illuminate hardship. A single flame hissed faintly above cracked ceilings, its light trembling with every draught. It brightened rooms without warming them, a visual deception that made the cold feel sharper by contrast. Shadows clung to corners where the light could not reach, and the air remained stale and wet, heavy with the residue of too many breaths. The lamps consumed fuel that families could scarcely afford. Every hour of light meant a calculation: darkness or debt, visibility or warmth. Many chose the former. Nights were spent half seeing, half remembering the shape of familiar rooms. Children learned to navigate by memory, stepping around broken chairs and sleeping bodies, while mothers rationed the flame as carefully as food. Where the gas burned steadily, it brought its own dangers. Fumes lingered low in poorly ventilated spaces, mixing with smoke from weak fires and the sour scent of damp bedding. Headaches were common. Dizziness passed without comment. A child's sudden sleepiness was watched with quiet fear. The light that promised safety carried the risk of suffocation, but it was still chosen because darkness, too, had its threats. On Christmas night, the contrast sharpened. In wealthier homes, gaslight gleamed from chandeliers and polished fixtures, reflecting off glass and metal, multiplying itself until rooms seemed to glow from within. In the slums, light remained solitary, one flame per room, sometimes shared between families. It revealed patched clothing, empty plates, hands reddened by cold. It exposed more than it comforted. The poor understood the lie instinctively. Light did not mean warmth. Illumination did not mean care. Gaslight merely allowed suffering to be seen, not eased. It cast clear outlines around problems no one intended to solve. Shadows stretched longer in winter, and the flame only sharpened their edges. Children gathered close beneath the lamp, not for heat, but for reassurance. Faces looked different in gaslight, eyes larger, cheeks hollowed, expressions softened by flicker. Stories were told quietly, not of miracles or feasts, but of endurance. A mother spoke of spring as if it were a certainty. A father described a job that might come after the holidays. These were small, careful hopes, offered in the weak circle of light, like fragile objects. Outside, lamps marked the boundaries of neglect. Streets deemed important glowed brighter, maintained more carefully. Alleys faded into darkness after a few steps. The city revealed its priorities through illumination alone. Where light ended, responsibility ended with it. As the night deepened, the gas was turned down or off entirely. Darkness reclaimed the rooms, pressing close, erasing the fragile comfort of visibility. The cold remained unchanged. Beds were shared. Coats were layered. Breath fogged the air until sleep finally dulled sensation enough to pass. Gaslight faded, but winter did not. The lie lingered, that brightness equaled care, that visibility equaled value. In the Victorian slums, Christmas passed under dim lamps that showed everything and warmed nothing, leaving families to endure another night, illuminated only by endurance itself. Christmas arrived on the calendar, but it did not arrive in practice. In the slums, The day passed like any other, distinguished only by colder air and thinner patience. Work did not pause for sentiment. Hunger did not acknowledge holy days. For those who lived by the hour or the piece, rest was not a tradition, it was a risk few could afford to take. Before dawn, doors opened, as they always had. Boots were pulled on while still stiff with yesterday's damp. Hands numbed themselves around tools already worn smooth by repetition. Men left for docks, yards, factories, and streets where labor waited without ceremony. Women followed different paths, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, carrying loads, minding children, not their own. Christmas morning passed unnoticed in their movements, marked only by the absence of those few employers who could afford to close their doors. Children worked too, they always had. Small bodies were useful in narrow spaces, small hands quick at sorting, tying, carrying. On Christmas Day, they rose from sleep already tired, wrapped themselves in garments that barely qualified as protection, and went where they were sent. For some, this meant factories still humming. For others, the streets selling matches, carrying parcels, running errands for pennies that mattered more than celebration ever could. The city's machinery did not slow. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys. Wheels turned. Steam hissed. The industrial heart of London beat on, indifferent to the day's supposed significance. Where wealth allowed pause, it did so quietly, behind closed doors. Where poverty ruled, labor continued openly, visibly, without apology. Those who stayed home did not do so by choice. Illness kept them inside. Injury slowed them. Exhaustion overtook them at last. Even then, rest was uneasy. A day without work meant a day without wages, and the knowledge settled heavily in the mind. Christmas could not erase the arithmetic of survival. Tomorrow's rent remained. Tomorrow's hunger waited patiently. Food, when it came, was often eaten standing. A crust torn and shared. Tea stretched thin, warmed again and again to coax something like comfort from it. There were no tables laid with ceremony. No hours set aside for gathering. Meals were interruptions between tasks, taken quickly, before returning to whatever labor remained. The soundscape of the slums reflected this reality. There was no hush of universal rest, no shared pause. Footsteps echoed steadily, carts rattled, voices called out prices and instructions. Somewhere, a bell rang for mass, but its sound competed with industry and necessity. Faith might have marked the day, but work defined it. For some, employers offered small concessions, an early release, a token coin, a scrap of food presented as generosity. These gestures were accepted carefully, gratitude performed as expected, but they changed nothing fundamental. A half-day's mercy still ended in the same cold room. A gifted meal did not warm the week ahead. Children noticed the difference more sharply. They heard stories of Christmas elsewhere, of rest, of gifts, of time claimed for family. These stories arrived distorted, like the carols that drifted into their streets. They learned early that holidays were privileges, not guarantees. That celebration was something one might witness, not inhabit. As evening approached, the workers returned. Faces were drawn tighter than usual, not from disappointment but from fatigue layered upon fatigue. Hands were cracked, clothes were wet. Christmas had not softened the day. It had merely passed through it, leaving no mark. In the Victorian slums, the holiday did not interrupt labor, it exposed its necessity. It revealed how little room there was for pause, how narrow the margin between endurance and collapse truly was. Christmas ended as it began, folded into routine, absorbed by work that never learned to stop. The Christmas remembered was never the Christmas lived. Even as the season unfolded in the slums, another version was already being written elsewhere, cleaner, warmer, trimmed of discomfort, and preserved like something delicate behind glass. It appeared in illustrations, sermons, and later, stories told by those who had never stood in a room where frost crept along the floorboards and breath clouded the air. This myth took shape quietly. It spoke of hearths and harmony, of families gathered in cheerful abundance, of charity flowing freely from those who had enough to those who did not. It softened winter into scenery and poverty, into a temporary inconvenience, something noble and brief, resolved by goodwill and a well-timed gift. It insisted that Christmas belonged to everyone equally, that the season itself leveled the world. In the slums, this version of Christmas was unrecognizable. The poor did not reject the myth out of bitterness. They simply did not see themselves reflected in it. Their Christmas did not glow. It endured. It passed without resolution. It left no neat conclusion, no lesson learned, no transformation promised by morning light. The season did not rescue them from circumstance. It revealed how deeply circumstance had settled in. Yet the myth persisted because it was useful. It allowed comfort without confrontation. It reassured the comfortable that hardship was rare, softened by tradition, managed by kindness. It reframed suffering as background, something that made generosity feel larger without requiring it to be lasting. The slums became part of the story only as contrast, a dark edge that made warmth elsewhere appear brighter. Printed images helped the illusion spread. Christmas scenes showed clean children with rosy cheeks, even when dressed in rags. Snow fell gently, never soaking through boots. Rooms were small but cozy, never crowded or damp. Hunger appeared only as anticipation, soon to be relieved. These images circulated widely, shaping memory before reality could object. Stories followed. Tales of redemption, of sudden fortune, of benevolence rewarded. They ended neatly, often by the final page. The poor became symbols rather than people, patient, grateful, improved by suffering. Their endurance was romanticized, their exhaustion ignored. Christmas, in these narratives, was not merely a holiday but a moral instrument, smoothing the roughest truths into something palatable. For those living the season, this rewriting was subtle but powerful. It taught children what their lives were supposed to look like, and then quietly showed them they did not measure up. It taught adults that hardship could be endured with enough cheer, that despair was a personal failure rather than a structural one. It placed responsibility inward, where it could do the most harm. Church sermons reinforced the myth gently, often without malice. Christmas was framed as a test of humility, poverty as an opportunity for spiritual refinement. Endurance was praised. Complaints were cautioned against. The season's suffering was described as meaningful, necessary, even beautiful in its own way. The poor listened because listening cost nothing and questioning cost too much. Over time, the remembered Christmas grew louder than the real one. It outlived those who contradicted it. It survived into later generations, polished by nostalgia and repetition. The slums were reduced to atmosphere, their realities blurred into general hardship that conveniently resolved itself when the holiday ended. But for those who lived it, Christmas did not become a story. It became a pattern. Winter followed winter. Hunger returned. Cold lingered. The myth moved on without them, leaving behind only the quiet understanding that what was celebrated was not what was endured. The Victorian Christmas remembered today is a construction carefully assembled, selectively preserved. The Christmas of the slums existed beneath it, unseen, uncelebrated, and unchanged by the stories told above it. Cold did not arrive with winter. It lived there already. When December came, it merely took its place more openly, shedding any pretense of being temporary. In the slums, cold was not a season, but a condition settled into walls, lodged beneath floorboards, threaded through bedding that never fully dried. It waited patiently through warmer months, then rose again at the first true drop in temperature, familiar and unwelcome. Rooms held the cold the way lungs hold damp air. Brick soaked it in during the night and released it slowly by day, ensuring there was never a true moment of warmth. Floors sweated with chill. Walls breathed moisture. Even bodies gathered close could not push it back for long. Heat, when it existed, was fleeting, a borrowed thing, rationed carefully and lost quickly. Families learned the geography of cold intimately. They knew which corners numbed fingers first, which patches of floor stiffened feet by morning. They learned to sit on crates, to stack paper beneath boots, to sleep turned inward, limbs folded tight. Children were trained in these habits early, long before they understood why. It was not taught as survival, it was simply how one lived. The cold crept into breath. Lungs tightened. Coughs lingered longer than they should have, deepening into something that no amount of rest could undo. The damp made bones ache, especially in those who worked outdoors or stood for long hours in unheated spaces. Old injuries announced themselves loudly in winter, joints swelling, fingers refusing to bend. Pain became part of the daily weather. Fuel was the constant worry. Coal cost money that vanished too quickly. Wood was scavenged from broken crates, discarded furniture, splintered doors. Fires were built small and kept smaller. A flame was encouraged, never indulged. It flickered briefly, offering hope more than heat, then died down to embers that glowed without warming. Hands hovered over them anyway, chasing comfort from memory rather than reality. Cold reshaped time. Nights lengthened not because the sun set earlier, but because sleep came poorly. People woke stiff and aching, limbs slow to respond. Mornings began with shivering rather than light. The day did not warm. It merely shifted the cold's position. By evening, the damp returned heavier than before. Christmas brought no exemption. The holiday did not soften the walls or ease the draft beneath doors. If anything, the contrast made the cold sharper. Songs spoke of warmth while breath fogged the air. Sermons promised comfort while toes went numb. The season highlighted what was missing rather than supplying it. Children adapted with unsettling ease. They played in coats worn thin, fingers red and cracked, cheeks burning with exposure. Their games were short-lived, movements quick to keep blood flowing. Laughter, when it came, sounded brittle, edged by discomfort. Adults watched closely, knowing when play tipped into danger, knowing when cold turned from nuisance to threat. For the sick, the cold lingered longest. Fevers broke unevenly, recovery slowed. Illness dragged on, unrelieved by rest that was never truly restful. Beds stayed damp. Blankets smelled of old moisture and breath. Each winter claimed its share quietly, without ceremony or outrage. By spring, the cold retreated only partially. It left behind aches that never fully faded, coughs that returned with the next season, habits shaped by years of endurance. Winter did not teach the slums anything new. It confirmed what they already knew, that cold was not an interruption to life, but one of its most reliable companions. In the Victorian slums, cold did not come and go. It stayed, it learned names, it memorized routines. And every December, it reminded those who lived beneath it that survival itself was the only warmth they could depend on. Children in the slums learned quickly that sound carried consequences. Laughter drew attention. Crying wasted breath. Questions revealed needs that could not be met. By Christmas, many had already mastered the art of quiet, not the silence of obedience, but the silence of understanding. They learned when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Christmas morning arrived without announcement. There were no footsteps of surprise, no rustle of paper, no sharp intake of breath at something new. Children woke, as they always did, cold first, then hunger, then awareness. They lay still for a moment, listening. Adults slept lightly in winter, and waking them too early served no purpose. The room smelled of damp cloth and yesterday's fire, long extinguished. Some children remembered stories. They had heard them in the streets, half-finished and exaggerated tales of oranges, of toys carved from wood, of stockings filled overnight by unseen hands. These stories lingered like dreams, never fully believed, never fully dismissed. The youngest waited longest, scanning corners and shelves with hopeful patience before understanding arrived quietly and without drama. Silence followed. Not disappointment that required expectation. What settled instead was recognition. Christmas was not meant to interrupt their lives. It was something observed from the outside, like snow falling on a roof that leaked regardless. Children rose carefully, pulling on the same clothes they had worn to bed. They moved around sleeping bodies, stepping where the floorboards groaned least. Noise was rationed throughout the day. Adults spoke softly, conserving energy. Children followed suit. Play was subdued, limited to motions that did not require space or sound. A stick traced shapes in dust. A string was wound and unwound between fingers. A shared look replaced conversation. Games adapted themselves to confinement and fatigue. In some rooms, a child cried anyway. Hunger or cold eventually overwhelmed restraint. The sound was met not with anger but with urgency. A hand pressed gently over a mouth, a whispered reassurance. Not because the child was wrong to cry, but because crying changed nothing. Silence was a form of protection, learned early and reinforced often. Older children understood more. They watched adults closely, noticing how faces tightened when money was mentioned, how shoulders slumped after counting coins. They learned not to ask for what could not be given. Gratitude was practiced carefully, even when nothing was offered. This skill served them well later, when charity required performance as much as need. Christmas visitors sometimes arrived missionaries, volunteers, benefactors moved by the season. Children were brought forward, lined up, assessed. They learned how to stand still, how to accept what was handed to them without reaching. They learned which expressions earned approval. A toy or treat was received with restraint, pleasure contained to acceptable levels. Excess joy looked ungrateful. Excess disappointment looked spoiled. Afterward, silence returned heavier than before. Gifts broke, or were shared or traded quickly. Treats disappeared within minutes. The day resumed its usual rhythm. Children adapted without complaint, because complaint was an indulgence they had never been taught to afford. By nightfall, exhaustion settled in. Small bodies curled inward for warmth. Dreams came unevenly, filled with fragments of stories heard but never lived. Morning would come cold again. Christmas would pass unnoticed except for the memory of having stayed quiet enough to survive it. These children did not remember Christmas as wonder or loss. They remembered it as a day that asked nothing new of them, only that they continue being careful, observant, and silent. They learned early that survival required restraint, and that the loudest needs were often the least likely to be answered. Smell lingered longer than sound in the slums. It settled into fabric, into hair, into the grain of wooden furniture worn smooth by years of contact. By Christmas, the air itself seemed saturated heavy with coal smoke, damp stone, and the close, inescapable presence of too many bodies sharing too little space. It was a smell that did not shock those who lived within it. It simply existed, constant as the cold. Coal defined the season. When it burned, it did so imperfectly, fed sparingly, into grates that leaked heat and held smoke. The scent clung to everything, a bitter, acrid note that scratched the throat and dulled the senses. It crept into clothing hung near the fire, into blankets laid too close for warmth, into lungs already strained by winter air. Even when the fire went out, the smell remained, ghost-like, reminding the room of what had briefly been possible. Human breath layered itself over the coal. In overcrowded rooms, it fogged the air visibly, rising and falling in pale clouds. At night, the smell grew stronger, sour, damp, intimate. It was the scent of bodies sleeping without space to turn, of illness breathing quietly from bed to bed, of warmth created only by proximity. Windows stayed closed against the cold, sealing the air inside until it felt used, tired, incapable of renewal. Christmas gatherings did not change this. If anything, they intensified it. Extra bodies meant extra breath, extra dampness, extra weight pressing down on already exhausted air. A pot boiled briefly, releasing steam that condensed instantly on walls and ceilings, streaking them with moisture. The room smelled of thin broth and coal smoke, a combination that promised sustenance but delivered little. Visitors noticed the smell immediately. Charity workers paused at thresholds, adjusting scarves, expressions carefully neutral. They spoke quickly, performed their duties, and left with relief visible in their posture. The poor watched this with quiet awareness. Smell betrayed their circumstances before words ever could. It marked them unmistakably as other, as somewhere no one wished to remain longer than necessary. Children became accustomed to it early. They learned to associate certain smells with safety, the faint sweetness of bread when it appeared, the sharpness of soap on rare washing days. But mostly they learned endurance. The air they breathed was the air available. Complaining about it made no sense. It was everywhere. Illness carried its own scent. Fever altered breath. Coughs left traces in the air. Damp bedding held the smell of sickness long after recovery or death. Christmas did not cleanse these rooms. No pine, no spice, no festive aroma cut through the prevailing odors. The season's promised sweetness never reached them. Outside, the smell followed people into the streets. It mixed with sewage, horse waste, rotting refuse. The city exhaled constantly, and the slums lay directly in its path. Snow absorbed the odors, holding them briefly before releasing them again as it melted into grey slush. Winter did not purify. It preserved. By evening, rooms were thick with layered air, coal that no longer burned, breath that had nowhere to go, damp that seeped upward from floors. People grew drowsy not from comfort but from fatigue and stale oxygen. Sleep came shallow and restless. Dreams, when they arrived, were heavy and indistinct. The smell of Christmas in the slums was not pine or spice or candle wax. It was coal and breath and damp wool. It was the scent of endurance, of bodies persisting in spaces that resisted them. It lingered long after the day passed, embedding itself in memory more firmly than any carol or celebration ever could. Hunger behaved differently at Christmas. It did not grow louder. It grew more precise. In the slums, appetite was a familiar ache, usually dull enough to be endured with routine and distraction. But during the holiday, it sharpened, honed by proximity to abundance. The city announced its feasts loudly enough for the poor to hear, and hearing made the absence cut deeper. Smells drifted from afar, roasted meat carried on the cold air from streets that glowed warmer, bakeries that produced more in December than any other month. These scents thinned as they traveled, arriving diluted and teasing, never close enough to satisfy. They stirred the body into remembering what fullness felt like. Stomachs tightened. Saliva gathered uselessly. The senses were awakened only to be denied. Markets displayed excess openly. Poultry hung in rows. Puddings stood wrapped and waiting. Fruit appeared in winter as a kind of spectacle, bright against grey. The poor passed these displays quickly, eyes trained forward, movements practiced. Lingering cost nothing monetarily, but it cost composure. Children were guided past with firm hands. Looking too long invited questions that could not be answered. Meals in the slums grew thinner during the holiday, not thicker. Wages paused for some. Prices rose for seasonal goods. Whatever small reserves existed were stretched across days that demanded more without providing it. Bread was sliced carefully. Tea was watered down further. Fat, when it appeared at all, was saved and reused, its flavor fading with each return to the pan. Christmas charity offered interruptions rather than solutions. A bowl of soup here, a parcel there. These moments brought relief that vanished almost as soon as it arrived. Hunger learned quickly to resume its place. The body adapted, slowing itself, conserving energy. Children became quieter, adults grew irritable or withdrawn. The city celebrated loudly, and the contrast made restraint harder to maintain. Sound played its part. Laughter carried from open doors elsewhere. Cutlery clinked, glasses touched. These sounds arrived without invitation, slipping through streets and windows, reminding the slums that fullness existed nearby but unreachable. Hunger listened. It compared. It waited. For some, memory worsened the ache. Those who had once eaten better felt the difference most keenly. They remembered tables, portions, the warmth that followed a proper meal. Christmas returned these images vividly, making the present feel narrower by comparison. Others, who had never known abundance, experienced hunger as confirmation this was how the world was arranged, and holidays did not rearrange it. Children felt hunger with blunt honesty. They asked once, sometimes twice, then learned the limits. Older siblings distracted younger ones with stories or games that required little movement. Mothers chewed bread longer than necessary, giving the impression of fullness. Fathers offered their portions quietly, insisting they were not hungry. These exchanges were unremarkable, practiced and repeated across rooms and streets. Night deepened the ache. Cold amplified it. Sleep arrived slowly, interrupted by empty stomachs and the distant sounds of celebration finally fading. In the dark, hunger became abstract again, less sharp but more persistent, a low throb that matched the body's rhythm. By morning, Christmas had passed without leaving nourishment behind. Hunger remained, patient and unchanged. It had learned, over years, that celebration elsewhere did not feed those here. In the Victorian slums, the season did not alleviate hunger, it refined it, teaching it to cut cleaner, last longer, and remind those who carried it exactly where they stood in the city's order. Joy passed through the slums like light through frosted glass, visible, distorted, and untouchable. It existed nearby, unmistakably real, yet never meant for those who watched it from the margins. Christmas made this separation clearer than any other day. The city displayed its happiness openly, and the poor learned to observe it without expectation. From doorways and street corners, they saw families moving together, faces flushed not only from cold, but from anticipation. Parcels were carried openly, laughter unguarded. Carriages rolled past with curtains drawn back just enough to reveal warmth inside. Shop windows performed happiness relentlessly, arranging abundance as though it were effortless, natural, deserved. The slums became a gallery for someone else's celebration. Adults watched with practiced detachment. They had learned long ago that envy wasted energy better spent enduring. Their expressions remained neutral, eyes lowered or turned away, movements efficient. They registered joy as information rather than invitation. It told them which streets to avoid, which doors would not open, which hours belonged to others. Children struggled more. They watched longer, curiosity outpacing caution. Their faces pressed close to glass they knew they would never cross. They studied expressions, gestures, objects whose purpose they could only guess at. Adults intervened gently, redirecting attention, guiding them onward before longing hardened into something dangerous. Joy was loud elsewhere. It rang from houses thick with light and heat, spilling into the streets in bursts of sound. Music played without restraint. Voices rose without fear of consequence. In the slums, sound remained measured. Doors closed early. Conversations stayed low. Joy's volume alone made it foreign. Even charity events reinforced the distance. Those invited were visitors, not participants. They stood in lines, accepted portions, offered gratitude. Laughter, when it appeared, was cautious, timed to signal appreciation rather than ease. The joy belonged to the giver, reflected back politely, never claimed outright by the receiver. The poor understood this instinctively. Joy required security, the knowledge that warmth would last, that food would return, that rest would not threaten survival. Without these foundations, happiness became brittle. It risked disappointment. It risked exposure. Better to observe joy from afar, acknowledge its existence, and return to the work of enduring. As evening fell, the performance elsewhere intensified. Candlelight multiplied behind curtains. Shadows danced freely on walls that held no damp. The slums darkened by contrast, lamps turned down to save fuel, windows sealed against cold rather than open to celebration. The boundary between worlds sharpened with the night. Some families attempted small imitations. A song hummed quietly, a story retold, a shared moment of stillness acknowledged as special by unspoken agreement. These gestures were modest, careful not to promise more than could be sustained. They were not joy as advertised, but something adjacent, a recognition of closeness, a pause in routine, a shared breath. Outside, fireworks cracked faintly in distant districts, brief flashes against the sky. Children watched them from between buildings, counting seconds between light and sound, marveling at something both beautiful and irrelevant. The noise echoed, then faded. The darkness returned, unchanged. By the time Christmas ended, joy had left no residue behind. It had passed through sight and sound, never settling. What remained was familiarity, the steady rhythm of survival resuming without transition. The poor did not mourn the absence. They had never expected presence. In the Victorian slums, joy was something you learned to recognize without reaching for. It belonged to others, visible enough to remind you of its shape, distant enough to ensure it could not be mistaken for yours. The rooms were never meant to contain this many lives. They had been designed with a single body in mind, perhaps two, at most a narrow space, with just enough air to circulate, just enough floor to cross in 3 steps. But in the slums, rooms learned to stretch beyond their intent. They absorbed people the way damp brick absorbed cold, quietly and without protest. By Christmas, every inch was claimed. Beds pressed against walls held more than one sleeper, bodies aligned carefully to maximize warmth rather than comfort. Mattresses sagged under shared weight. Children slept sideways at the foot of beds, curled tightly, knees drawn up to avoid slipping onto the floor. Others slept beneath tables, under chairs, wherever gravity and habit allowed rest to happen. Privacy dissolved entirely. There was no separation between waking and sleeping, between eating and resting, between illness and health. Everything occurred in the same confined space. Breath mixed. Coughs echoed close enough to be felt. Dreams, when they came, were interrupted by movement, by the sound of someone turning, by the quiet negotiation of limbs seeking a tolerable position. Christmas added nothing new to these arrangements. If anything, it intensified them. Visitors arrived. Relatives came seeking warmth or shelter for the night. Refusing them was unthinkable. Space adjusted itself again, bodies rearranged, comfort sacrificed without discussion. Overcrowding was not a problem to be solved, it was a condition to be managed. The air grew heavy quickly. Windows remained shut against the cold, sealing moisture inside. Walls darkened with condensation. Clothing hung near bodies to dry, never fully succeeding. The smell of breath and damp cloth thickened as the evening wore on. By night, the room felt smaller still, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward. Children adapted instinctively. They learned how to make themselves small. They folded into corners, rested against knees, slept sitting upright when necessary. Their bodies bent easily to circumstances adults could no longer tolerate. They learned to wake without startling others, to move without stepping on hands or faces. These skills were learned early, and never forgotten. Adults endured differently. Muscles stiffened, sleep became shallow and fragmented. Every movement risked disturbing someone else. Rest was taken in pieces rather than whole. Pain became background noise, acknowledged but rarely addressed. There was no space for complaint, no room for resentment. Survival depended on cooperation enforced by necessity. Illness moved freely in such spaces. Fevers passed from body to body without resistance. Coughs deepened. Recovery slowed. There was nowhere to isolate the sick, nowhere to grant quiet or warmth without depriving others. Christmas did not pause this exchange. It passed through rooms already burdened, leaving nothing behind but another night endured. The rooms remembered everything. They held the heat briefly, then released it. They absorbed sound, then echoed it back. They bore witness to whispered arguments, to shared grief, to moments of exhaustion so complete they resembled peace. By morning, the space returned to its waking configuration, bedding folded, bodies moving carefully, the day beginning without ceremony. These rooms were not homes in the way stories described them. They were containers for laboring bodies, for shared breath, for endurance repeated nightly. Christmas entered them briefly and left without altering their purpose. In the Victorian slums, rooms built for one learned to hold six, not because they expanded, but because those inside them learned how to endure less. Blankets were counted carefully in the slums. They were measured not by comfort, but by necessity, threadbare layers passed down, patched, folded, and shared until their original purpose had thinned into something symbolic. By Christmas, every scrap of cloth had been pressed into service, yet warmth remained elusive, hovering just beyond reach. Wool, when it existed, was coarse and worn smooth by years of use. Cotton absorbed damp and held it close. Blankets carried the memory of bodies long after they had shifted positions, but they did not trap heat for long. Cold seeped upward from floors and inward from walls, settling beneath covers as though invited. Even fully wrapped, sleepers felt the chill creep along their backs, pooling where fabric thinned and skin met air. At night, blankets became communal property. One covered several bodies, stretched tight, edges tucked beneath chins and elbows in a careful geometry of shared survival. Children were placed in the center, flanked by adults whose bodies served as barriers against the worst of the cold. Parents lay rigid, afraid to move and disturb the fragile arrangement. Sleep arrived reluctantly, fragmented by numbness and discomfort. Blankets carried more than cold. They held smells: coal, smoke, sweat, illness. They were rarely washed in winter, water too cold, fires too weak to dry them properly. Dampness lingered, making the fabric heavier, less willing to insulate. Each night, they were shaken out briefly, then pulled close again. The ritual repeated, without expectation of improvement. Christmas did not bring new coverings. Gifts of blankets, when they appeared at all, were unevenly distributed, arriving through charity with conditions attached. Those received were accepted with gratitude carefully performed. Those not chosen watched quietly, understanding the arithmetic of scarcity. A new blanket meant relief for one household, not the street. Warmth, like charity, did not multiply itself. Children learned early that blankets were not guarantees. They kicked them off in restless sleep, waking with cold limbs and blue fingers. Older siblings tucked them back in wordlessly, adjusting positions, sharing what little warmth remained. Complaints were rare, cold was expected. Blankets were assistance, not solutions. For the sick, blankets offered false reassurance. Fever made bodies burn beneath covers that failed to protect against drafts. Sweat soaked fabric that froze quickly once illness passed its peak. Shivering followed. Recovery slowed. The body worked harder than it should have, energy wasted on fighting the cold rather than healing. Morning revealed the truth plainly. Blankets were peeled away reluctantly, stiff with damp, folded and set aside. The room felt colder without them, but not dramatically so. Their absence changed little. Clothing replaced them. Layers added, until movement became difficult. The day resumed. Outside, snow clung to windowsills and roofs, indifferent to the efforts made indoors. Blankets might soften the night slightly, but they could not alter the season. They could not keep winter out any more than thin walls could. In the Victorian slums, blankets were gestures rather than safeguards. They promised warmth without delivering it fully, offering comfort just enough to endure another night. They did not solve the cold. They simply delayed its worst effects, allowing sleep to come briefly before winter reclaimed its place beside every resting body. Fire was the first thing counted and the first thing lost. By Christmas Eve, many hearths were already cold, their grates grey with the memory of heat. Ash lay undisturbed, not from neglect, but from restraint. There was nothing left to burn, and no sense in pretending otherwise. In the slums, the absence of fire was not dramatic. It announced itself quietly, in the way breath grew sharper indoors than out, in the way hands stayed clasped long after there was no warmth to chase. Evening fell early. Light faded from the courts and alleys, and the rooms grew smaller as darkness settled. Families gathered closer out of habit rather than hope. The hearth stood empty, a square of black iron and brick that looked almost accusing in the lamplight. It had once been the center of the room, a promise of survival. Now it was a reminder of how quickly fuel disappeared when wages did. Coal had been rationed carefully in the days leading up to Christmas. A scoop here, a handful there, fires kept low and brief. There was always the calculation, burn now or save for later. Many chose later, believing the cold might worsen, believing tomorrow might be harder than today. Christmas Eve arrived anyway, indifferent to planning, and the fire never returned. Without flame, the room felt exposed. Cold gathered openly, no longer pushed back by flickering resistance. Damp crept along the floor and up the walls, settling into joints and lungs. The sound of the city seemed closer without the soft crackle of burning coal to soften it. Footsteps outside echoed more clearly. Distant laughter carried longer. The contrast sharpened everything. Children noticed first. They edged closer to adults, seeking warmth that no longer radiated outward. Hands were rubbed together, then tucked beneath arms. Breath fogged the air steadily, rising in pale clouds that hovered before dispersing. The youngest asked quietly if the fire would be lit later. The answer came gently, without explanation, because explanation did not warm anyone. Meals were colder too. Whatever food existed was eaten without heat, or warmed briefly over a borrowed flame that was extinguished immediately after. The taste of cold bread lingered longer in the mouth. Tea, when there was any, cooled quickly, offering comfort only for a moment. Christmas Eve supper passed without ceremony, the act of eating reduced to function. The hearth, once active, became a place to gather anyway. People sat near it, out of habit, as if proximity alone might coax warmth from stone. Stories were told softly, not festive tales, but familiar ones, repeated often enough to require little energy. Silence filled the gaps. There was no singing. Cold tightened throats, and voices saved themselves for necessity. Night deepened. Without firelight, shadows thickened in the corners. The gas lamp hissed faintly, its glow thin and insufficient. Blankets were pulled tighter. Bodies arranged themselves carefully. The geometry of shared heat recalculated for the colder night ahead. Christmas Eve stretched on, unmarked by tradition, defined only by endurance. Some remembered other years, not better ones, just different configurations of the same scarcity. Fire had come and gone before. It would return, perhaps, after wages resumed, after charity arrived, after winter loosened its grip. For now, the hearth remained cold, and the night pressed inward. When sleep finally arrived, it did so reluctantly. The cold did not retreat. It lay alongside them, patient and familiar, sharing the room as fully as any person. Christmas Eve passed without flame, leaving behind no glow to remember, only the quiet knowledge that survival did not depend on fire alone, but on the stubborn refusal to yield when it was gone. Beds were not guaranteed objects in the slums. They were arrangements, negotiated nightly and dismantled by morning. A bed might be a frame with a sagging mattress, or a pile of rags layered carefully to suggest one. More often, it was the floor itself, claimed temporarily by bodies too tired to argue with, the cold pressing up from beneath them. The floors were never neutral. Stone and warped boards held winter like a grudge. They radiated chill steadily, even after brief contact with warmth. A body laid down felt the cold immediately through thin layers of cloth, creeping upward into hips and spine. The sensation did not shock, it warned. Those who slept low learned to shift constantly, chasing pockets of tolerable numbness before stillness set in. At Christmas, these arrangements grew more crowded. Visitors arrived seeking shelter from colder rooms elsewhere. Children displaced adults, adults displaced themselves. A hierarchy formed without discussion, the youngest elevated onto beds if any existed. The sick granted the least exposed spaces, the rest spreading out across the floor with resigned efficiency. There was no complaint. Complaints wasted heat. Mornings revealed the cost. Limbs stiffened into unfamiliar shapes. Backs ached sharply before dulling into persistence. Rising required planning, a slow unfolding, fingers pressed to the floor for leverage, breath controlled to manage the shock of standing. The day began with pain already accounted for, folded into routine like hunger and fatigue. Blankets did little to interrupt the cold's advance from below. They slid and bunched during the night, leaving calves and feet exposed. Coats were worn to sleep, collars pulled high, buttons fastened tight. Boots remained on for some, laces loosened just enough to allow circulation without surrendering warmth entirely. These choices were not comfortable, they were effective. Children adapted faster than adults. Their bodies bent easily, joints forgiving angles that would cripple someone older. They slept in positions that looked impossible, folded against walls or tucked beneath furniture. Their dreams were shallow but persistent, interrupted by the need to shift or the sound of someone else turning nearby. By morning, they were awake before dawn, alert despite the night's discomfort, accustomed to starting the day already tired. The floor collected more than cold. It gathered damp from the air, seeped moisture into bedding laid directly upon it. Illness thrived here. Coughs deepened. Fevers lingered. Recovery slowed. There was no way to lift everyone off the ground, no spare height to distribute. The floor remained the final common surface, shared by all. Christmas stories spoke of beds as places of rest, of morning revelations, of comfort found beneath covers. In the slums, beds, when they existed, were practical tools. They offered marginal improvement, not sanctuary. Floors were simply the more honest option, making no promises they could not keep. Night after night, bodies returned to the same places, leaving faint impressions that vanished by daylight. The floor did not remember who had slept there. It did not care. It remained cold regardless, waiting patiently for the next arrangement of limbs and blankets. When Christmas passed, the floors did not notice. They did not warm. They did not soften. They remained exactly as they had been, reliable in their indifference. Beds came and went, shifted and shared, but the floor endured as the final, constant, hard, cold, and unavoidable. In the Victorian slums, sleep was negotiated with the ground itself, and every morning, those who rose from it carried the quiet understanding that rest, like warmth, was something to be earned repeatedly, never assumed, and never fully achieved. Illness did not recognize Christmas. It did not slow its advance or soften its grip for the sake of calendars and bells. In the slums, sickness moved with the same steady indifference it always had, threading itself through overcrowded rooms and weakened bodies without pause or apology. Winter merely made its work easier. Coughs lingered longer in December. They deepened, grew wetter, more persistent, echoing through thin walls and shared air. What began as a chill became a rattle in the chest, then a fever that burned through nights already cold enough to exhaust the healthy. The damp settled into lungs and refused to leave. There was no space for isolation, no spare room to separate the well from the unwell. Illness belonged to everyone once it entered. Children fell sick first. Their small bodies struggled against cold floors and insufficient food, immune defenses worn thin by routine deprivation. A child's flushed face on Christmas morning did not signal excitement. It signaled fever. Mothers watched closely, counting breaths, measuring warmth with the backs of their hands. They knew the signs. They had learned them early. Doctors were distant figures, visited rarely and reluctantly. A consultation cost money that was already owed elsewhere. Remedies, when prescribed, were often indistinguishable from hope itself: rest, warmth, nourishment. None of these were available in sufficient quantity. Medicines that could be afforded dulled pain without curing cause. Laudanum quieted coughs and eased distress, but it did not clear lungs. It bought time without guaranteeing outcome. Christmas charity occasionally extended to the sick. A visit, a prayer, a parcel containing broth or coal. These gestures arrived unevenly, dependent on visibility rather than need. They offered temporary relief, not recovery. Fever did not respect gratitude. Infection did not pause for hymns. Adults worked through illness whenever possible. Missing a day meant missing wages, and wages were already insufficient. Men went out coughing, wrapped scarves tight, breath burning with effort. Women scrubbed and carried with aching joints, dizziness accepted as part of the day. Only collapse earned rest, and even then, rest was uneasy. Night was the worst. Fever dreams came in fragments, interrupted by shivering or sweat-soaked bedding that chilled as soon as the body cooled. Blankets clung damply, breath grew shallow. Those nearby slept lightly, alert for changes that might signal danger. Death did not announce itself loudly in these rooms. It arrived quietly, often before dawn, leaving behind a body that looked unchanged except for its stillness. Christmas morning sometimes revealed these losses. A child did not wake, an elder's breathing did not resume. The day continued anyway. Arrangements were made without ceremony. Grief folded itself into routine, postponed until survival allowed attention. The city celebrated elsewhere, lights bright and rooms warm enough to forget the fragility of the body. In the slums, illness reminded everyone of it. It stripped away pretense, exposing how little margin existed between endurance and collapse. Christmas did not heal, it did not protect. It passed over sickness the way snow passed over refuse, covering nothing permanently. By the time the holiday ended, illness remained. Coughs persisted, weakness lingered. Those who recovered did so slowly, never fully returning to strength before the next challenge arrived. Those who did not recover were absorbed into memory. Their absence registered quietly. In the Victorian slums, illness observed no calendar. It did not honor holy days or seasonal hope. It moved steadily through Christmas and beyond, a constant companion to poverty, reminding those it touched that survival was never guaranteed, not even on the day the world insisted it should be. Morning came quietly to the slums, as it always did. There was no sudden brightness, no collective stirring. Dawn seeped in through cracks and thin glass, a pale suggestion of light that revealed more than it offered. On Christmas morning, the rooms looked no different than the night before, bodies still layered together, breath faint in the cold air, blankets heavy with damp. It was often a child who was noticed first. A mother reached instinctively, as she had done countless mornings before, hand seeking the familiar warmth of a small body beside her. Sometimes she paused before touching, a hesitation learned through experience. Warmth meant life. Cold meant questions no one wished to answer. The room held its breath as she pressed her palm gently to a cheek, then to a chest that did not rise. There was no scream, not at first. Sound felt inappropriate, almost wasteful. Grief arrived muted, shaped by necessity. Other sleepers stirred. Someone struck a match to the lamp, the gas hissing softly as light spread thinly across the room. Faces gathered, expressions already understanding what words had not yet been spoken. The child lay as if asleep. Christmas did not mark the body in any visible way. There was no sense of ceremony to the moment, no acknowledgement from the season that a life had ended beneath it. The cold had done its work patiently, aided by hunger, illness, and exhaustion accumulated over months and years. Children died often enough that shock dulled quickly. The slums learned this cruelty early. Still, each loss carried its own weight. The smallness of the body made absence more pronounced. There was suddenly space where there had never been space before. A corner of the room felt wrong simply because it was empty. Practical matters followed immediately. The child needed to be covered properly, positioned with care. The living still required attention, other children needed feeding, adults needed to work. There was no allowance for lingering. Christmas did not grant permission to stop the day. Neighbors came quietly, offering presents rather than solutions. Words were few. Everyone knew the pattern. This was not a tragedy unique enough to interrupt routine. It was part of the season, part of winter's toll. Sympathy expressed itself through small acts, watching the other children, fetching water, sharing what little could be spared. The city beyond continued its celebration. Bells rang, doors opened elsewhere to warmth and laughter. The contrast was sharp but familiar. In the slums, death and Christmas had learned to coexist without comment. Arrangements were made later, when time allowed. Burial required money, and money required time to gather. Sometimes the child remained in the room for hours, laid out carefully, a blanket pulled up to the chin. Children were told not to touch. They obeyed, watching quietly, absorbing the lesson without explanation. By afternoon, the room adjusted. The day pressed on. The body was removed when it could be. The space it left behind did not fill itself. It lingered, an outline visible only to those who knew where to look. Christmas afternoon passed without acknowledgement. The loss folded into the ongoing work of survival. For the family, the date did not become sacred. It became blurred. Christmas was remembered not as a holiday, but as the day the cold finally took what it had been threatening to take for weeks. There was no bitterness attached to the season, only clarity. Winter had claimed another, and winter would claim more before it was finished. In the Victorian slums, Christmas morning sometimes revealed what night had already decided. A child did not wake, and the day continued anyway, indifferent and unaltered, leaving those who remained to carry on with a knowledge learned too early and repeated too often that survival was never promised. Not even on the morning the world insisted was holy. Walls in the slums were thin by design and thinner still by neglect. Brick cracked, plaster flaked away, wood warped and shrank with every winter. Sound traveled freely. Carrying more than voices, it carried lives. Privacy was an idea that did not survive these walls. Neither did despair. One family's suffering rarely remained contained. A cough in one room echoed into the next. An argument bled through shared walls until it became communal. Grief announced itself quietly at first, then lingered in the air, long after words stopped. The architecture ensured that no hardship remained singular for long. Everything was shared, willingly or not. At Christmas, this closeness intensified. More people crowded into fewer rooms, doors opening reluctantly to relatives who had nowhere else to go. The walls absorbed the added weight of voices and breath, flexing but never breaking. Each room, carried the emotional residue of the next. A mother's weeping passed through plaster and reached a neighbor's ear before it reached morning. There was no escaping it. Even silence transmitted meaning. A room that fell too quiet drew attention. People listened without intending to, reading absence as carefully as sound. Someone noticed when footsteps did not return, when coughing ceased abruptly, when a familiar rhythm was missing. The walls kept records more faithfully than memory. Despair did not erupt dramatically. It seeped. It moved slowly through shared spaces, settling in corners and spreading along beams and floorboards. One family's hopelessness became another's anxiety. A single misfortune lost work. Illness, death shifted the atmosphere for everyone nearby. The slums operated as a single organism, each room a cell, affected by the health of the whole. Christmas sharpened this effect. The season drew attention to contrast, and contrast bred quiet resentment. Not toward neighbors, never that, but toward the unseen forces that pressed them all into the same narrow existence. No one spoke openly of it. Complaints dissipated before forming. Everyone knew the others were listening, and listening carried its own weight. Children grew up inside this shared emotional space. They learned to interpret tone through walls, to recognize distress before words made it clear. They absorbed adult anxieties without context, understanding unease long before understanding cause. Christmas did not shield them from this education, it accelerated it. Some nights, despair moved visibly. A raised voice cut through rooms. A door slammed hard enough to rattle frames down the row. Someone cried openly, breaking the unspoken rule of restraint. These moments passed quickly, contained by neighbors who intervened gently or waited until exhaustion restored order. There was no judgment, only recognition. Other nights, despair remained quieter. It settled into posture, into the way people sat longer without speaking, into the way conversations stalled and failed to restart. It showed itself in meals eaten without comment, in children sent to bed early because there was nothing left to distract them with. These were the nights that lingered longest. Christmas Eve magnified the shared burden. Carols drifting from outside collided with the sounds within, coughing, murmured prayers, whispered arguments about money and coal. The walls caught it all and held it together, blending celebration and suffering into something indistinguishable. No one needed to look far to see the truth of the season. It pressed in from every side. Mourning did not reset this atmosphere. It carried forward, layered over by routine and necessity. Work resumed, illness persisted, loss remained. The walls did not forget overnight. They continued to transmit despair alongside survival, ensuring no one carried their burden entirely alone. In the Victorian slums, shared walls meant shared despair. It moved freely, uncontained by property lines or family names. And yet, within that constant exposure, there existed something quieter, an unspoken understanding that endurance itself was collective. If suffering could not be isolated, neither could survival. Alcohol did not arrive in the slums as indulgence. It arrived as strategy. In winter, and especially at Christmas, drink was not taken to mark joy or excess, but to dull sensation, to warm the body briefly, to quiet the mind long enough to sleep, to blur the edges of hunger and cold that refused to soften on their own. Gin shops and public houses glowed invitingly against the dark streets, their windows misted, their interiors louder than the rooms people came from. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and breath, warmer than anywhere else a man might stand without paying rent. For a few coins, one could buy heat that rose quickly in the chest, spread outward, and faded just as fast. That brief warmth was often worth the cost. Christmas sharpened this exchange. The season brought wages delayed, hours shortened, and debts waiting patiently. It also brought the expectation, spoken or implied, that people should feel something more than endurance. Drink offered an answer that did not ask questions. It made cold feel manageable for a moment. It made disappointment less articulate. Men drank most visibly, but not exclusively. Women took spirits quietly at home when they could, measured in careful amounts. A swallow before bed to still shaking hands. Another to ease the ache in joints locked by damp. Children were not given alcohol openly, but they felt its presence in the room, in voices that softened, in movements that slowed, in the faint chemical sweetness that mixed with coal smoke. Alcohol worked quickly and left quickly. Its warmth was deceptive, drawing blood to the surface while deepening the body's vulnerability to cold. But knowledge of this did not change behavior. The immediate mattered more than the later. Tomorrow's risk was already full. Tonight needed surviving. Christmas drinking did not resemble celebration. There were no toasts, no raised glasses for abundance. Drink was taken standing, leaning, swallowing without ceremony. In public houses, conversations circled the same. Few topics, work that might return, illness that might pass, debts that would not wait. Laughter appeared occasionally, brief and brittle, evaporating as soon as it surfaced. Some drank to forget the contrast. Carols drifted past open doors, muffled by walls thick with sound and smoke. Drink blurred the line between what was heard and what was felt. It softened resentment without resolving it. For a short while, the city's divisions felt less sharp. At home, alcohol served a different purpose. It loosened stiffness, allowed sleep to come faster. It quieted the mind when silence pressed too hard. In rooms without fire, a swallow replaced flame, offering a momentary illusion of warmth that blankets could not provide. Parents drank carefully, aware of how quickly control could slip. Children needed tending, even when adults were numb. Not everyone drank. Some avoided it entirely, having seen its costs too clearly. Others could not afford it at all, relying instead on endurance alone. But for many, alcohol remained one of the few accessible tools against winter's pressure. It was not joy, it was relief, fleeting and imperfect. Morning exposed its limits. Heads ached, mouths dried. The cold returned undiminished. Whatever warmth alcohol had offered was gone, leaving the body no better prepared for the day than before. Shame sometimes followed, but necessity overshadowed it. The drink had served its purpose. It had gotten them through the night. Christmas passed without curing reliance or condemning it. Drink remained what it had always been in the slums, a temporary answer to permanent conditions. It did not mark celebration. It marked survival. In the Victorian slums, alcohol was taken not to honor the season, but to endure it, a brief, burning substitute for the warmth the world had withheld. Night carried sound differently in the slums. Without daylight to distract or labor to drown it out, every noise sharpened, stretched thin across shared walls and narrow courts. Of all these sounds, coughing endured the longest. It did not rise suddenly or pass quickly. It lingered, rhythmic and insistent, threading itself through sleep until it became part of the darkness itself. A single cough could wake an entire room, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Everyone knew what it meant. A dry cough suggested irritation, cold air scraping lungs already worn. A wet cough carried weight fluid, weakness, the possibility of something worse. Children learned to distinguish them before they could read, lying awake and listening, understanding more than they were ever told. Christmas night did not soften these sounds. If anything, they multiplied. More bodies in close quarters meant more breath, more damp, more opportunity for illness to deepen. The air thickened quickly after dark. Windows sealed tight against the cold. Each cough displaced stale air briefly, then left it heavier behind. Sleep came unevenly. People drifted off in fragments, waking whenever the coughing grew closer or more violent. A fit in one room echoed into the next, then down the row. Someone sat up, offering water. Someone else rubbed a back through thin fabric. These gestures were practiced, automatic, carried out without fully waking. The night demanded cooperation. Children were often the quietest listeners. They lay still, eyes open, counting coughs without realizing they were doing so. Each pause between them carried tension. Silence did not bring relief. It brought anticipation. When coughing stopped too abruptly, fear sharpened. Adults noticed these moments too, though they pretended not to. The sound of coughing shaped the night's rhythm. It replaced bells and clocks. It measured time more accurately than hours. A cough every few minutes meant one thing. A coughing fit that left someone gasping meant another. Long nights taught the slums how to read illness by ear alone. Christmas elsewhere was marked by music and laughter, but here, coughing dominated. It broke through moments of stillness like a reminder that bodies were failing quietly all around. No song drowned it out. No prayer silenced it. It continued until exhaustion forced sleep or weakness forced quiet. For those coughing, night was a trial. Lying flat made breathing harder. Sitting up stole rest. Blankets pressed damply against chests already tight. Each breath required effort. Each cough drained strength that could not be replaced by food or warmth. The night asked more of them than they could comfortably give. For those listening, helplessness settled in. There was little to be done beyond offering water, adjusting bedding, whispering reassurance that meant more than it promised. Medicine was scarce. Doctors were absent. Winter had set its terms, and the slums met them nightly. Toward morning, coughing softened for some. For others, it deepened. Dawn brought no immediate relief, only the next phase of endurance. Those who had slept rose stiff and aching. Those who had not slept at all simply continued. Fatigue folded into movement. The sound did not leave with Christmas. It persisted into the days that followed, into January and beyond. It marked winter more clearly than snow or frost ever could. In the Victorian slums, the night was never truly silent. It breathed, rattled, and coughed around those who lay within it. And long after the season's carols faded, the sound of coughing remained a constant reminder that survival was negotiated breath by breath through darkness, until morning arrived again. Morning arrived without ceremony. It did not break the night so much as dilute it, thinning darkness into a grey that revealed everything it had concealed. In the slums, daylight did not promise improvement. It simply made endurance visible. Christmas morning or not, the light crept in the same way, reluctant, pale, and cold. Rooms emerged slowly, shapes sharpened. Faces took form again, drawn tight by sleep that had not restored anything. Breath still fogged the air. Blankets were peeled away with care, stiff from damp, and folded automatically. The floor felt colder than the night before, as though it had been storing chill for the moment bare feet touched it. The body registered this immediately, sending a jolt upward that forced wakefulness whether it was wanted or not. There was no sense of beginning. The day resumed rather than started. Hunger carried over from the night unchanged. Illness revealed itself more clearly in daylight, flushed cheeks, sunken eyes, lips cracked by cold. A cough sounded worse in the morning, less muffled, more exposed. The night's endurance showed its cost plainly. Christmas decorations elsewhere glowed brighter by comparison. In the slums, there were none to remove, no traces of celebration to dismantle. The season had passed through without leaving debris behind. Morning tasks waited patiently, fetching water, preparing thin food, tending to children, leaving for work if work still existed. These routines did not adjust themselves for holidays. Light entered through windows that offered little protection from the cold. Glass was thin, often cracked, sometimes patched. It admitted daylight without warmth, revealing damp streaks on walls and the faint sheen of condensation that had never fully dried. The room looked tired in the morning, as though it too had survived the night with effort. Children stirred first, restless and alert despite discomfort. They moved carefully around sleeping adults, already accustomed to managing themselves. Christmas did not alter their instincts. They did not search for surprises. They searched for permission, a nod, a glance, a word indicating what was expected of them next. The day shaped itself around necessity. Outside, the city woke unevenly. Wealthier streets brightened quickly, shutters opening to reveal warmth and color. In poorer districts, doors opened cautiously, releasing air that felt no different from inside. Footsteps began again, carts rolled, work resumed where it could. The morning made no allowances. Those who had lost someone in the night felt the light most sharply. Daylight did not soften grief, it clarified it. The absence became undeniable once the room was fully visible. Christmas morning did not sanctify loss. It demanded arrangements, decisions, movement. The living were compelled forward regardless. Charity workers sometimes appeared in daylight, their visits scheduled for visibility rather than need. They arrived with parcels and words chosen carefully. Gratitude was performed. Relief was accepted. The light witnessed these exchanges, making them feel official, almost theatrical. When they left, the room returned to itself, unchanged except for the brief interruption. By mid-morning, the cold had settled back into its familiar positions. The light did nothing to dislodge it. If anything, it emphasized how little warmth the sun offered in winter. Shadows shifted slightly, but the temperature did not follow. The body adjusted expectations accordingly. Morning light elsewhere was associated with renewal, a fresh start, a cleared table, a sense of after. In the slums, there was no after. There was only continuation. Christmas did not conclude with dawn. It dissolved into routine without acknowledgement. As the day moved on, the memory of night lingered. Fatigue pressed down. Illness persisted. Hunger waited. The light remained indifferent, illuminating hardship without easing it. In the Victorian slums, morning did not arrive as relief. It arrived as exposure, revealing that nothing had changed overnight, and that survival would be demanded again, immediately, under the same pale light that had witnessed it all before. The box appeared without warning, as many things did in the slums. It arrived carried by men with clean coats and careful expressions, set down in a public place where it could be seen: a mission hall, a church porch, the corner of a street deemed respectable enough to host it. It was wooden, plainly built, sometimes painted, sometimes not, and always watched. This was the Christmas charity box, and it carried with it a complicated weight. Charity did not drift into the slums quietly. It announced itself. Notices were posted. Word traveled quickly. People adjusted their movements to coincide with its hours. Children were washed as well as water allowed. Adults straightened clothing worn thin by necessity, attempting to look deserving without appearing demanding. The box waited, inert and patient, while a line formed in front of it. Inside, there were parcels, bread, perhaps, or soup ladled into tin containers, sometimes coal, measured carefully, occasionally a small treat, wrapped and symbolic, rather than sustaining. The contents varied each year, dependent on donors whose names would never be known to those who received the offerings. The box was generous within limits, and those limits were never explained. Receiving from the box required performance. Gratitude had to be visible. Words had to be chosen carefully. Too much eagerness suggested greed. Too little suggested ingratitude. Faces learned to hold the correct expression: humble, thankful, restrained. Children were coached in advance, reminded to say thank you, to keep their voices low, to accept whatever was handed to them without question. The act of receiving was public. Neighbors watched, volunteers watched, sometimes clergy watched. Charity did not arrive privately, it arrived as spectacle. The poor became part of the Christmas display, their need arranged neatly alongside seasonal generosity. The box served not only to distribute aid, but to confirm narratives that suffering existed, that kindness responded, that balance had been restored. But the balance never lasted. A loaf of bread fed a family briefly. A scoop of coal warmed a room for a night. Soup quieted hunger without eliminating it. The box did not address rent, illness, or the long winter still waiting beyond the holiday. It offered interruption, not resolution. Everyone understood this, even as they lined up again the following year. Those who were not chosen watched from a distance. Supplies ran out. Lines ended. The box closed. There was no appeal, no explanation offered. Absence became personal, even when it was not meant to be. Some learned to arrive earlier next time. Others learned not to expect anything at all. Children remembered the box vividly, not for what it gave, but for how it felt. The waiting, the watching, the rules that did not apply elsewhere. They learned that help came with conditions, that it could be withdrawn as easily as it was offered. Christmas taught them this lesson gently, wrapped in seasonal language, but the lesson remained. After the box was removed, the street returned to itself. The air grew quieter. Conversations resumed their usual tone. The interruption passed. Those who had received carried their parcels home carefully, guarding them against theft and loss. Those who had not returned empty-handed, faces unreadable, already recalculating survival without seasonal aid. By evening, the box was gone entirely, leaving no mark behind. The slums did not look different. The cold did not retreat. Hunger did not disappear. Charity had touched the surface and moved on. In the Victorian slums, the Christmas charity box was never a solution. It was a moment brief, conditional, and watched. It offered proof that kindness existed somewhere, even if it did not stay long enough to matter. Soup lines formed like shadows at the edges of streets, winding along alleys and spilling into courtyards where space had never been generous. They arrived in the mornings, hot only for a moment, steam rising quickly into the cold air, dispersing before it could reach the lungs of those who needed it most. The smell carried far enough to draw attention, but too thinly to satisfy. Hunger followed those lines as closely as poverty itself, sharpening with expectation before the first ladle was served. Standing in line demanded more than patience. It demanded performance, hands clasped respectfully, faces composed carefully, eyes lowered when words of thanks were offered, but not so low as to suggest shame. Gratitude was rehearsed, measured, visible. Those who spoke too loudly risked appearing greedy. Those too quiet risked seeming ungrateful. The line itself became a stage where humility was performed, and survival required obedience to its invisible rules. Children were especially careful. Mothers held them close, whispering instructions how to keep silent, when to step forward, where to place their hands. A misstep could result in embarrassment, or worse, being passed over for the next portion. In this delicate choreography, every movement counted. Hunger demanded attention, but so did the watchful eyes of volunteers, ministers, and neighbors. The soup itself was modest, a thin broth, often watery, occasionally carrying scraps of meat or vegetables too small to fill a stomach, but enough to warm the chest briefly. A ladle's measure passed quickly from hand to hand, its quantity dictated by scarcity rather than generosity. Recipients accepted what they could, balancing desire with necessity, savoring warmth that evaporated almost as soon as it arrived. Noise followed the line, the clatter of tin bowls, the low murmur of voices rehearsing gratitude, the soft shuffle of feet on damp stone. Occasionally a cough or whimper escaped, an uncontrolled intrusion, quickly suppressed by a stern glance or whispered reprimand. The line maintained its discipline, not for comfort, but for survival. Adults watched children closely, understanding that hunger sharpened impatience. They intervened gently, guiding behavior, smoothing expressions, correcting posture. A child looked too long at another's portion, and a hand steered their gaze elsewhere. Small lessons were enforced quietly, without breaking the rhythm of the line, for interruption might risk access entirely. Volunteers maintained their own distance, balancing efficiency with visibility. They spoke softly, their tone measured, offering warmth only as formality. Hands passed bowls mechanically, gestures precise. Charity was given in public, observed carefully, ensuring both giver and receiver performed their roles correctly. The act was as much about optics as sustenance. By the time the line dissolved, the effect was temporary. Soup had done its work only briefly. Hunger remained, returning as shadows lengthened and cold pressed inward again. The room to which recipients returned was unchanged, the floor still icy, the walls still damp. Relief existed in a single moment, and even that moment depended on compliance, not comfort. Christmas in the soup line revealed its own hierarchy. Observation mattered as much as need. Those who could navigate the rules received warmth, however small. Those who could not waited for the next opportunity, learning once more that survival in the slums required vigilance, patience, and obedience. In the Victorian slums, soup lines were more than food. They were ritual. They were demonstration. They were a fleeting intersection of generosity and necessity, showing both the limits of charity and the endurance required to accept it. Gratitude was expected, public, and rehearsed, because even sustenance, when scarce, demanded performance before it could sustain. Salvation arrived most visibly in the slums, dressed in words. Christmas brought ministers and missionaries, their breath visible in the winter air, as they crossed streets thick with mud and snow. They came bearing sermons and scripture, calling out promises of mercy and redemption that might have been true somewhere, but rarely within the rooms they entered. In the slums, salvation was not a warmth one could touch, nor a meal that filled. It was a doctrine recited loudly, designed to persuade the living that suffering had meaning and that obedience mattered more than relief. Rooms filled quickly. Families gathered where the preacher indicated, forming neat rows in cramped spaces that had never allowed such order before. Children sat cross-legged on floors, hardened by cold. Adults leaned against walls, backs stiff, heads bowed. The air grew thick with anticipation, but also with the weight of damp, coal, and human breath, the familiar odors of winter pressing in on all sides. Words began to flow. Sermons spoke of virtue, of humility, of gratitude, of sin, and its redemption. They were rhythmic, punctuated by the faint echo of a cracked voice, occasionally reinforced by hand gestures or sharp glances. For those listening, every syllable was measured against their reality, the chill that penetrated layers of cloth, the hunger pressing deep in stomachs, the illness that moved from body to body without mercy. Salvation sounded beautiful and impossible at once. Children watched with wide eyes, trying to reconcile the fire of language with the absence of warmth in their bones. They learned early that words could promise, even if reality could not. They repeated verses quietly, echoing instructions whispered by parents, a performance within a performance. Reciting scripture became another layer of survival, an acknowledgement of presence, a mark of obedience, a temporary shield from scrutiny. Adults were no less cautious. Nods were timed, responses measured. A cough or muttered complaint was quickly suppressed. The preacher's eyes could linger, assessing compliance, judging spirit as though it were visible. In these moments, belief was not merely personal, it was social currency. Participation, however perfunctory, ensured that aid, attention, or the slightest mercy might continue, even if only temporarily. Christmas amplified this ritual. Sermons referenced the season directly, emphasizing charity, the nativity, and the blessings promised to the faithful. They encouraged the congregation to see suffering as moral refinement rather than injustice. For many, this framing offered solace, a way to organize their misfortune into narrative. Yet, solace was not warmth, and moral refinement did not feed children. The preacher departed eventually, leaving rooms quieter but no less cold, no less hungry, no less worn. The residue of words lingered like smoke, faintly scenting blankets and walls, shaping thought and expectation. The bodies remained in their usual arrangements, but minds carried the sermons with them, a fragile scaffold to prop up endurance against reality. Those who could not attend found stories filtered through neighbors, half-remembered phrases, moralized accounts of salvation, instruction turned anecdote. The lesson traveled invisibly, shaping behavior, curbing complaint, reinforcing hierarchy. By evening, the effect of sermons had waned. Hunger returned with steady precision. Coal lost its heat. Illness remained indifferent to piety. The room, once attentive, returned to its unaltered rhythm. Salvation, for all its words, had provided only a momentary impression, a shadow of relief that could not survive the night. In the Victorian slums, Christmas salvation was never tangible. It existed in syllables and gestures, in instruction and observation. It promised meaning where none could change circumstance. And those who listened learned to appreciate its presence, not as warmth, not as food, not as health, but as a faint, fleeting bulwark against the weight of unceasing winter. Christmas transformed the slums into a stage, though none of the actors wished to perform. The poor became part of a seasonal spectacle, their labor, their misery, and their endurance arranged for observation by those who dwelled elsewhere. Streets, courts, and alleys carried the muted sounds of survival alongside the distant laughter and music of wealthier quarters, creating a contrast that was impossible to ignore. Charity, when it arrived, played a central role. Soup lines, coal deliveries, parcels of food, and small gifts were distributed not solely to aid, but to be seen distributing. Volunteers, ministers, and donors hovered, ensuring that recipients performed gratitude correctly. Heads bowed, hands clasped, voices offered in measured thanks. These were the expectations, and the slums knew them well. Failure to comply risked exclusion or the perception of ingratitude. The poor learned quickly that observation was part of the transaction. Children were the most visible. They were coached to stand properly, to look at the giver politely, to accept what was offered without question. Laughter had to be restrained, excitement tempered. A child who could not follow this invisible script might find a hand lightly pressed on their shoulder, a whispered instruction, or worse, a skipped reward. The performance mattered as much as the sustenance itself. Adults carried the same burdens. Their posture, their words, their attentiveness were scrutinized, often silently. Every gesture was interpreted. A nod could mean gratitude. A sigh could suggest ingratitude. The entire community became an audience and a cast simultaneously. The holiday illuminated behaviors that were always present but usually overlooked. Christmas made survival ceremonial. Windows amplified the spectacle. Those with light and warmth allowed glimpses inside, their interiors glowing against the grey streets. Observers could see the contrast. Neatly wrapped parcels on one side, bare floors, and shared blankets on the other. The slums were framed in relief against wealth. Shadows deepened along walls, emphasizing the division between spectacle and reality. The poor became part of the scenery, a living lesson in endurance, their struggles curated by circumstance. Churches contributed. Sermons, carols, and processions created soundtracks for the observation. Hymns echoed through alleys, drifting past open windows, striking ears that knew the difference between sound and comfort. The faithful inside proclaimed joy, the faithful outside bore it silently. Observation became a lesson in moderation, to endure without showing deficiency, to witness excess without envy. Even the streets themselves participated. Mud, ice, and soot emphasized the harshness of the environment. Children navigating narrow lanes demonstrated agility and caution. Adults moving carefully with parcels, infants, or labor tools showcased resilience. Every step was part of the performance, reinforcing the seasonal narrative that those who suffered could do so gracefully. By evening, the spectacle persisted even as visitors left. The streets grew quieter, the glow of lamps diminished, but the awareness remained. Those who had been watched internalized the gaze, moving through rooms and alleyways with a consciousness sharpened by observation. Survival had always required attentiveness, but Christmas demanded it more. In the Victorian slums, the poor were never unseen, but during the holidays, they were observed systematically. Hunger, cold, labor, and endurance became components of a living display, judged by silent audiences beyond their reach. Joy, warmth, and celebration passed them by, leaving behind only the knowledge that survival, performed correctly, was itself a kind of acknowledgement, a seasonal spectacle that demanded every ounce of care and grace the slums could muster. Christmas in the slums was often measured by scarcity, and scarcity could never be divided evenly. A single gift, small and unremarkable in better circumstances, became a treasure contested by many, its distribution a lesson in endurance, patience, and quiet disappointment. One gift for 100 children was a reality repeated each year, as immutable as winter and twice as cruel. The gift itself was rarely remarkable. A tin toy, a small loaf of sweetened bread, a thin blanket, or a scrap of cloth became the focal point of desire. It was carried carefully into rooms, placed on a table or in a basket, and left to be claimed. Its presence was announced, but it was never abundant. The children gathered immediately, some standing taller, some pressed against walls, all watching with a mixture of hope and caution. The line that formed was orderly only by necessity. Mothers and fathers guided their children, instructing them in restraint while bracing themselves for disappointment. The rules were unspoken. Patience first, gratitude second, compliance always. Any deviation could result in being overlooked entirely. Children internalized this quickly, their manners polished by survival, their expressions controlled to avoid drawing attention that could turn opportunity into denial. Observation was constant. Volunteers, clergy, and neighbors all watched as the gift was offered. Children learned to regulate not only their desires, but the visible signs of them. Eyes lowered just enough. Hands extended slowly. Words of thanks rehearsed, neither too eager nor too restrained. The gift, though singular, became a test. Who could receive it with dignity? Who could witness it without complaint? Who could endure the inequity without faltering? Even within families, the gift demanded negotiation. Older siblings might relinquish their chance to younger ones. Parents might decide to keep it for a child they considered weaker or sicker. Decisions were made quietly, without argument, guided by experience rather than sentiment. One gift for 100 children required compromise, strategy, and a clear understanding of survival. The act of receiving carried more than its nominal value. It brought attention, recognition, a fleeting sense of worth. For a moment, the child held more than a tin toy or a scrap of cloth. They held the acknowledgement of their place in the hierarchy, of their ability to navigate the rules of observation and expectation. Gratitude became both shield and requirement, a signal that they understood the world's demands. Inevitably, most children left empty-handed. Their disappointment was tempered by training. They knew the ritual, understood the scarcity, accepted the outcome. They whispered instructions to each other, passed along advice for next year, or simply endured quietly. Silence became another lesson, patience, restraint, and the quiet acceptance of circumstance. The giver departed eventually, leaving behind no promise of repetition, no guarantee of abundance. The room returned to its routine, the children to their duties, the adults to work. The gift remained, small, its moment brief, its influence lingering only in memory and in the careful recalibration of expectation. Christmas did not alleviate want, it dramatized it. One gift for 100 children demonstrated the limits of generosity, the vast distance between hope and reality. It taught endurance, not celebration. Desire, moderated by circumstance, became a daily exercise. Gratitude, performed carefully, was a currency more valuable than the object itself. In the Victorian slums, gifts were never plentiful. They were lessons, tests, and symbols. One gift for 100 children reminded everyone, loud and quiet alike, that survival depended not on abundance, but on learning how to live within scarcity, how to perform patience and gratitude, and how to endure without complaint the only celebrations the season could truly offer. Help arrived in the slums as both blessing and burden. Christmas, with its promise of charity and relief, made the presence of aid more visible than at any other time. Yet, in receiving it, the poor paid a price often invisible to those who gave. The gift of sustenance or warmth came tied with expectations, judgment, and the subtle weighing of virtue against circumstance. Those who sought assistance approached carefully. Soup lines, coal deliveries, and parcels of food required submission to rules both explicit and unspoken. Hands clasped too tightly suggested desperation, too loosely, ingratitude. Faces smiled, but never fully. Voices offered thanks, but measured, rehearsed, controlled. Every motion was watched, every glance assessed. Acceptance became an exercise in restraint, a negotiation as delicate as any financial transaction. Children learned quickly. Mothers whispered instructions on posture, expression, and speech. Knees were to remain together, fingers folded politely, eyes lowered or raised only at prescribed moments. A gift or bowl of soup was more than food, it was a performance, a test of comprehension, obedience, and survival instinct. Failure to perform correctly risked more than embarrassment, it risked denial, withdrawal, or subtle chastisement. Adults bore the same weight. The very act of accepting help required humility, even when pride was necessary to endure the rest of the year. Gratitude was never spontaneous. It had to be modulated to satisfy the observer's expectations. Anyone misjudging tone or timing could be deemed unworthy, treated with less consideration next time, or remembered poorly by those who passed judgment. Assistance carried with it a subtle calculus. How much warmth could be taken without forfeiting dignity? How much sustenance could be received without compromising self-respect? The slums themselves enforced the cost of help. Neighbors watched as offerings were accepted, marking those who fared well against those who received little. Gossip traveled swiftly, forming invisible lines of reputation. Children noticed the difference in how adults were regarded, learning early that the act of receiving was never merely personal. It resonated outward, shaping interactions long after the gift had vanished. Even the help itself was incomplete. Parcels were limited, soup portions thin, coal scarce. Accepting it meant acknowledging deficiency, demonstrating need. The recipient carried the awareness that their survival depended on generosity beyond their own making, that comfort, if only temporary, was conditional. Christmas offered assistance, but in doing so, highlighted the distance between want and provision. Religious instruction often accompanied charity. Blessings, prayers, and sermons reinforced the expectation that the poor must show virtue alongside receipt. Behavior was monitored. Compliance became part of the exchange. To accept without humility was a moral failing. To refuse out of pride risked punishment in the eyes of both God and neighbor. The price of help was measured not only in gratitude, but in conformity. By evening, the day concluded. Those who had accepted assistance returned to rooms, unchanged by miracle. Hunger would return, cold would persist, illness would remain. Only the memory of compliance, of having performed endurance correctly, lingered. The gift itself was temporary, but its lessons, carefully imposed, endured. In the Victorian slums, help never came freely. It demanded something in return: attention, obedience, humility, discretion. The poor learned early that aid was a contract, often unspoken, whose terms were measured not in gold or food alone, but in dignity surrendered, eyes lowered, and manners performed with care. Acceptance carried a price, and Christmas made that price unavoidable, visible, and relentless. Workhouses never slept, and neither did winter in the slums. Christmas arrived as it always had, a day measured not in joy, but in endurance, and for those unfortunate enough, in the unforgiving walls of the workhouse. Here, the poor learned quickly that relief came only through submission, that survival required compliance, and that even the promise of holiday cheer was filtered through discipline. The gates opened before dawn. A chill pressed against the stone walls and iron bars, biting through clothing and flesh alike. Children, barely dressed against the cold, shuffled in lines, their eyes wide but cautious. Adults followed, shoulders hunched against the wind, lips pressed tight. Every step inside the workhouse carried a silent understanding. Personal comfort was secondary, obedience paramount. Christmas offered no escape. Inside, warmth was rationed carefully. Fires burned low, sufficient only to stave off frostbite for the briefest moments. Blankets were thin, beds crowded, floors hard and unyielding. The air smelled of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the faint bitterness of coal smoke. It was a heat that only existed in fragments, dissipating as quickly as it was conjured. Food, when it appeared, was functional rather than festive. Christmas pudding was a rare luxury, often distributed unevenly, divided quickly to avoid conflict. Bread was stale but filling, porridge watery, broth thin. Children learned to eat without complaint, to savor small portions, to recognize that no more could be had, and that protest risked losing even what had been granted. Adults enforced calm, whispering instructions on posture, on silence, on patience. The workhouse had rules that extended beyond the walls. They existed in bodies, in posture, in the control of expression. Labor did not pause for celebration. Floors needed scrubbing, dishes washing, fires stoked, laundry sorted. Each task was performed under watchful eyes, evaluated for effort and efficiency. Slacking was punished. Enthusiasm, when expressed too openly, drew suspicion. The workhouse demanded attention and compliance, even on Christmas Day. Survival depended not on respite, but on completing one's duties to the letter. Children were trained to observe these patterns carefully. They watched older siblings, adults, and overseers, learning to anticipate expectations, to anticipate failure, to adapt quickly. Laughter was rare. It was muted, performed cautiously, sometimes reprimanded for being too loud. Any semblance of play required vigilance and discretion. Joy was never spontaneous, only permitted. Visitors arrived occasionally: church representatives, charity workers, inspectors. Their presence transformed routine into display. Residents moved carefully, ensuring that gestures of gratitude, attention, and diligence were visible. Compliance became a performance, lessons in humility taught alongside discipline. Christmas was observed, not enjoyed. By evening, the workhouse returned to its steady rhythm. Fires smouldered, beds were prepared for another night of layered bodies and stiff blankets, and cold seeped in from walls and floors. Hunger remained, as did fatigue, and the omnipresent awareness that relief was conditional and temporary. Christmas had passed, but the labor, the vigilance, and the endurance persisted. In the Victorian slums, the workhouse offered a sanctuary, only in the most literal sense: shelter from wind, rain, and absolute exposure. It did not offer warmth, comfort, or celebration. Christmas here existed as a faint echo, a reminder that survival required discipline, submission, and endurance, not festivity. Those within its walls learned that mercy came measured and fleeting, and that no season could alter the workhouse's demands. In the slums, children learned quickly that gratitude was not a feeling but a performance. By Christmas, many had already mastered the art of measured thanks, taught not by generosity, but by necessity. Every gift, every morsel of food, every scrap of coal was received with care, not because it was precious, but because failing to receive it properly could mean more than disappointment. It could mean exclusion, scrutiny, or shame. Instruction began quietly, often in the kitchen or at the edge of a bed. Mothers whispered guidance. Say thank you slowly. Look at the giver when you take it. Do not smile too broadly, or they will think you greedy. Fathers reinforced lessons with subtle gestures, demonstrating the posture of humility, the careful tone of voice, the timing of expression. Children repeated these instructions, first as imitation, then as habit, until the act became second nature. Christmas magnified these expectations. Charity arrived in parcels, soup lines, and small treats. Volunteers, clergy, and neighbors watched closely as gifts were distributed, evaluating not only the child's reception but the adult's guidance. Eyes were observed, hands noted. The slums had learned that performance mattered as much as need. Gratitude became both shield and obligation. Receiving a gift demanded a precise balance. Too eager, and the child appeared greedy. Too reluctant, and they seemed ungrateful. Movement had to be careful, hands extended slowly, fingers lightly curled around the object. Words had to be clear, polite, and controlled. Eye contact was critical, revealing attentiveness without demanding attention. Any misstep risked correction, either by whisper or gesture, sometimes by the quiet withdrawal of favor. Children internalized these lessons early. They learned to anticipate reactions, to gauge expressions before giving theirs. Their smiles were calibrated, their voices moderated. Even laughter, when permitted, was subtle, contained, and brief. Every interaction with a gift became an exercise in social awareness, a rehearsal of survival. Adults were complicit in this performance. They guided, corrected, and supervised, knowing that compliance was essential not only for the child's present, but for the family's future. Failure to perform gratitude correctly could jeopardize access to resources. Children became actors in a ritual dictated by necessity, observed by both the benefactor and the community. Over time, the practice became habitual. Children greeted every offering with the same measured motions. Repetition shaped behavior so fully that emotion became secondary. Gratitude was now externalized, a learned response rather than spontaneous feeling. The child performed seamlessly, body and voice in accord, a small participant in the larger machinery of endurance that sustained the household through winter and want. Even when gifts were modest, the performance mattered. A scrap of bread, a thin slice of coal, a small toy, each required the same precision. The act of receiving was more important than the gift itself. It reinforced order, minimized conflict, and confirmed one's place in the fragile hierarchy of scarcity. By evening, the child had rehearsed gratitude countless times. Eyes, hands, and voice moved predictably, guided by months of conditioning. The lesson was clear. Survival depended not solely on need, but on the ability to receive appropriately, to acknowledge the giver, and to maintain composure under observation. In the Victorian slums, Christmas did not teach joy. It taught performance. Children learned early that gratitude was a skill, not a sentiment, and that the careful execution of that skill could mean the difference between a cold night endured and a night left colder still. Leftovers from the rich were the currency of survival in the slums. Christmas, with its excesses in wealthier quarters, made this reality undeniable. Roasts, puddings, and breads that adorned tables in grand homes did not vanish. They travelled, intentionally or inadvertently, into the streets, the alleys, and the hands of those who could not afford even the simplest meal. Yet these gifts came with impermanence, inequality, and an unspoken reminder of distance. Carriages carried scraps away, dropping them near the margins of the city, behind shops or down narrow lanes. Servants discarded remains with haste, ensuring that what was given could not disrupt the appearance of order within the household. Those who waited below watched carefully, timing their steps, measuring the weight of possibility against the risk of exposure. A misstep could mean being seen by authorities or neighbors, risking censure, or worse, the denial of future scraps. Children knew the dance instinctively. They gathered near the edges of streets, eyes alert, hands ready to receive. Adults positioned themselves strategically, directing movement, guarding space, and ensuring no opportunity was lost. Hunger sharpened reflexes, cold stiffened movements. The slums had learned over years that timing, caution, and discretion were as necessary as speed. Leftovers were fragile promises, fleeting warmth, fleeting sustenance, fleeting security. Even when scraps were collected, the act of consumption carried vigilance. Bread torn hastily, meat shared in whispers, pudding divided silently. Those who received had to manage quantity carefully. Taking too much invited scrutiny, taking too little left the body weak. Children learned to negotiate these small portions, balancing survival with the social expectations imposed by neighbors and observers alike. Observation was constant. Other children watched, assessing who was quickest, who was strongest, who would be generous, and who would seize for themselves. Adults monitored for behavior that could disrupt order. Jealousy, greed, or complaint could have consequences beyond the immediate meal. In these streets, performance mattered as much as need. The leftovers were not merely food, they were a test, a social contract, and a fleeting relief rolled into one. The scraps carried more than nutrition. They carried the scent of the wealth that had produced them: sugar, roasted meats, spices that were otherwise inaccessible. The air itself seemed sweeter where they passed, teasing the senses of those who had known only bread, thin porridge, or water thickened with flour. Desire sharpened, hunger deepened. The contrast was cruel, an unspoken reminder of inequality reinforced by taste and smell. By nightfall, the leftovers had vanished. The streets were littered with traces, grease on stones, paper scraps, crumbs crushed under boots, but no sustenance remained. The families returned to rooms unchanged by the day, floors cold, walls damp, bodies hungry. The heat from the gift had long since dissipated. Only the knowledge remained that someone had eaten better nearby, that abundance existed, and that scarcity was enduring. Christmas did not alter this cycle. Leftovers from the rich arrived in limited supply, dictated by the whims of those above, and taken with caution by those below. They offered temporary relief, fleeting warmth, and a brief sense of advantage in a city that demanded endurance. And when they were gone, the slums returned to themselves, the cold, the hunger, and the unbroken rhythm of survival, leaving behind only the memory of scarcity and the faint, lingering scent of wealth. Boxing Day arrived with neither fanfare nor relief. In the slums, it was marked less by celebration than by the quiet disappearance of attention. Christmas, for those above, was over. Gifts, visits, and charity ceased as quickly as they had appeared. The slums were left once more to endure, and those who had counted on seasonal assistance learned that generosity had an expiration date. Morning opened cold and grey. The streets were damp from melting snow or frost pressed into mud. Windows of grand houses remained shut, shutters drawn tight against the early sun. Inside, rooms where coal had been rationed, where blankets had been shared, and where food had appeared only briefly, returned to their habitual chill. Families moved quietly, measuring each step, each breath, knowing the temporary reprieve had vanished. The charity that had sustained Christmas vanished just as definitively. Soup lines closed, parcels were collected or returned, coal deliveries ceased. Clergy departed, their sermons of salvation and hope no longer available. The hands that had offered small kindnesses or instructions on etiquette and gratitude were gone, leaving the poor to navigate the season's end unaided. Awareness of scarcity returned with clarity, sharper and more immediate than the day before. Children noticed first. They looked for remnants of gifts, for crumbs, for warmth left behind. Often, there was nothing. Lessons in patience, humility, and gratitude rehearsed and performed the day prior were now reinforced by absence. The season's spectacle had concluded, and with it the opportunity to participate in the illusion of abundance. Disappointment settled into routine, as efficiently as the cold had the night before. Adults understood the implications fully. Wages, work, and the unchanging march of survival reasserted themselves. Requests for assistance were met with the knowledge that opportunities had passed, that charity was finite, and that the world beyond the slums had moved on. Responsibility returned to those who had endured, uncompromising and unflinching. The day was measured in necessity rather than celebration. The streets themselves seemed to recognize the change. Footfalls returned to their usual rhythm. Carts rattled along familiar routes. The city's sounds shifted from seasonal indulgence back to the cadence of labor and obligation. Windows no longer glowed with the promise of hospitality or observation. Even the snow, briefly pristine with festive cheer, dulled in the grey light, returning to its usual dusting over filth and refuse. Illness, hunger, and cold reclaimed their prominence. Tuberculosis, coughs, and fever persisted unabated, unaffected by holiday generosity. Bread, thin and rationed, remained the staple. Coal, already scarce, demanded conservation. The temporary warmth and sustenance that Christmas had offered had been insufficient to change the realities of life, they had only highlighted them. Boxing Day revealed how fleeting relief could be, and how endurance remained the only constant. The contrast between the attention of Christmas and the silence of Boxing Day left its mark on every observer. Children learned that generosity was conditional. Adults understood the impermanence of kindness. The slums, once briefly illuminated by charity, fell back into shadow, as cold and hunger remained unaltered. In the Victorian slums, charity ended predictably. It had a beginning and an expiration, measured not by need but by the calendar of the affluent. Boxing Day did not mark a new season. It marked the return to reality. Survival continued, uncelebrated and uncompromising, a reminder that relief was fleeting, attention selective, and endurance, winter after winter, the only constant that remained. December 26th arrived with the quiet insistence of inevitability. The city exhaled into the morning, streets mottled with the residue of yesterday's charity, its fleeting warmth, and the ghosts of Christmas revelry that had never touched the slums. For those who lived in narrow alleys and damp rooms, the day brought no celebration, no leftover joy, only the steady return of routine and unyielding hardship. Windows were shuttered against the cold, or flung open briefly to release stale air before being closed again, leaving inside spaces filled with the combined breath of families who had slept shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with the familiar mixture of coal, damp wool, and human presence. It carried the memory of past warmth, brief and unearned, and reminded everyone that it was gone. December 26th emphasized absence more efficiently than Christmas had suggested possibility. Children stirred first, their small bodies alert, moving cautiously to avoid stepping on siblings still curled in corners or on shared blankets. They were aware even if only intuitively, that this day demanded the same vigilance as any other, to conserve, to avoid complaint, to endure. Lessons from Christmas were not forgotten. They had been rehearsed in performance, in expectation, in restraint. Now those lessons were applied silently to another day of scarcity. The streets were quiet in comparison to the day before. Soup lines had disappeared, charity deliveries had ceased. Volunteers, ministers, and inspectors had departed with the knowledge that the day after Christmas carried no obligation. Where celebration had passed, only exposure remained. The poor navigated the city carefully, avoiding muddy ruts and obstacles while keeping watch for remnants of aid that might linger, a scrap of bread, a discarded piece of coal, knowing that survival depended on recognizing opportunity without appearing greedy. Adults bore the weight of December 26th differently. They moved methodically through kitchens and corridors, assessing resources, dividing food, and preparing for the week ahead. Cold pressed against clothing insufficiently layered, and hunger reminded every body of its persistent presence. Illnesses, ignored or merely subdued over the holiday, regained their full measure of attention. Those who had relied on temporary relief from charity understood immediately that it was insufficient to alter reality. The rhythm of work reasserted itself. Laundry, scrubbing, and preparation resumed in every household. Outside, the city's machinery moved once more. Carts rolled over cobblestones, deliveries continued, and shops reopened, indifferent to the absence of wealth or festivity in the slums. Every action reinforced the separation between those who benefited from holiday abundance and those whose survival required diligence and patience. In the rooms themselves, December 26th carried its own lessons. Silence dominated. Conversations were limited, spoken in measured tones to conserve energy and warmth. Children played minimally, moving carefully to avoid conflict and disturbance. Adults calculated each step, each gesture, each decision with care. The day was not a continuation of Christmas, but a reminder that relief was fleeting, attention finite, and endurance necessary. By evening, light waned over streets already dim, shadows lengthened, and the slums settled back into the steady rhythm of winter survival. Hunger remained, cold pressed against walls, and the sick required vigilance. The brief illusion of abundance had passed, leaving behind only the quiet truth that survival depended entirely on those who could endure, adapt, and accept the world without expectation of reprieve. In the Victorian slums, December 26th was not a holiday. It was an exposure, a day that revealed the impermanence of aid, the selectivity of generosity, and the constant necessity of resilience. Christmas had come and gone, but the demands of survival continued, unaltered and unrelenting. Debt was a companion as constant as cold and hunger in the slums, and it waited patiently for Christmas to end. While the rest of the city celebrated with excess and cheer, the poor carried obligations that never paused for candlelight or carol. December 26th illuminated what the previous day had obscured: the balance sheets of survival, unpaid, unyielding, and insistent. Ledgers, when they existed, were kept in memory rather than ink. Shopkeepers, coal merchants, and landlords tracked promises and deferrals with unrelenting precision. Every coin borrowed, every loaf of bread advanced, every ration of coal provided, carried forward into the next day. Christmas did not erase the arithmetic. If anything, it intensified it, sharpening attention on debts accumulated over the year and highlighting what could not be settled immediately. Children observed quietly as adults calculated the day's resources against obligations. Fingers traced lines in ash on tables, numbers recited softly, every penny accounted for. Even the smallest misstep, failing to recall a due date, misplacing a token, overlooking a favor owed, could ripple outward, causing consequences measured not in punishment but in survival. The young learned early that debt demanded attention, compliance, and careful negotiation. The moment after Christmas was particularly cruel. Gifts, charity parcels, and temporary indulgences did not carry forward into the ledger. Food eaten yesterday had to be replaced today. Coal burned needed replenishment, and debts temporarily deferred by charity or seasonal kindness demanded immediate reckoning. Adults moved swiftly, organizing families, rationing stores, calculating hours of work required to repay yesterday's grace. The day was never about relief, it was about continuation. The streets reinforced this lesson. Vendors returned to their stalls, their eyes sharp, their voices quick and measured. Shopkeepers refused leniency, their ledgers open in memory if not in ink. Credit was rationed and measured, and any sign of weakness invited observation and admonishment. Borrowing was performed with precision. Repayment, even partial, was expected. Debt could not be ignored, and it never forgot the failures of the past. Children were taught the subtleties of debt alongside survival. They learned how to ask for food without demanding it, how to appear patient without signaling desperation, how to recognize which kindnesses carried future obligations. Gratitude, already rehearsed, became intertwined with debt, each gift accepted as something owed, each morsel eaten as a claim deferred. Even play was influenced by awareness. Roughhousing was avoided when it might lead to injury and an additional burden. Illness, hunger, and cold were measured against debt. A cough required medicine that might be borrowed. Hunger demanded bread that might be owed tomorrow. Coal needed to keep warmth was rationed with careful thought to what could be returned. Every action was framed within the invisible accounting of survival. By evening, the patient observer that was debt had not departed. It waited as the family counted what remained, what had been consumed, and what must be replaced. The ledger of survival had been balanced, temporarily, but the work of living under obligation continued. Sleep did not erase it. The morning would arrive with it, renewed and relentless. In the Victorian slums, debt was as enduring as winter. Christmas, with its brief gestures of generosity, did not pause it. Rather, it illuminated the distance between those who could give freely and those who had only obligations. Debt waited patiently, silent and exacting, teaching those who endured that survival was never unconditional, that mercy was fleeting, and that the next day would demand repayment in body, effort, and endurance. December 27th arrived with the same indifferent precision as every morning that had preceded it. In the slums, suffering had never been absent, only momentarily obscured by charity, warmth, or the faint distraction of Christmas. Now, with the holiday past, everything that had been deferred returned, relentless and unobserved by the world beyond narrow streets and narrow rooms. The poor learned that attention was fleeting and that survival depended on enduring the unseen as much as the visible. The air remained thick with coal smoke, damp wool, and human breath. Blankets, thin and shared, had been rearranged overnight to preserve what little warmth remained. Floors, still icy from the night, pressed upward through worn clothing. Hunger, quieted briefly by charity or indulgence, regained its intensity, gnawing at stomachs that had been softened by temporary relief. Every body in every room carried the memory of absence, the absence of food, heat, comfort, and care. Illness persisted as it always did. Tuberculosis, fever, coughs, and colds moved silently from bed to bed. Children stirred, not with excitement, but with discomfort. Adults rose stiff, their joints aching from nights spent sharing inadequate bedding. The sick, unable to rest fully, made the entire household more vigilant. Every sound, a groan, a cough, a shift in weight, demanded immediate attention, lest it escalate into crisis. Christmas had offered no true intermission. Suffering simply returned with the daylight. Outside, the city moved on. Streets that had hosted visitors, processions, and charitable distributions now fell silent. Shopkeepers resumed their routine, eyes sharp, voices brisk. Wealthy homes remained insulated, their warmth and abundance unrevealed to the poor except in fleeting glimpses through fogged windows. The contrast was cruel, emphasized by absence. Joy had passed, leaving only endurance. Children adjusted quickly. They learned to navigate the day with the same careful attention that had guided them through lines, charity, and observation during Christmas. Hunger, cold, and vigilance were constants. Games were brief, performed quietly to avoid dispute or exposure. Every interaction, every step, every glance was shaped by awareness of scarcity. Lessons in survival were reinforced, day by day, moment by moment. Adults bore invisible burdens as well. Debts previously deferred, resources exhausted, and illnesses unresolved required careful management. Each decision, how to allocate food, who would tend the sick, how to conserve fuel, demanded calculation. Mistakes carried consequences not only for the individual but for the household. December 27th reminded them that survival required attention to detail and an acceptance of relentless hardship. Charity, performance, and observation had ended. What remained was raw endurance. Every breath, every movement, every morsel consumed was conducted with awareness of scarcity and limitation. The slums returned to their permanent state, illuminated by no light but the faint gas flickering in rooms, warmed by no fire but the shared heat of bodies pressed together, and comforted by no charity but the faint skill learned from repetition and observation. December 27th revealed the truth of life in the Victorian slums. Suffering was invisible to the world outside, relentless in its return, and inseparable from the rhythm of daily existence. Christmas had been a brief interruption, but its passing highlighted how fleeting attention could be, how conditional mercy was, and how necessary endurance remained. In these streets and rooms, invisible suffering ruled quietly, and those who lived within it understood fully that survival demanded unbroken vigilance, patience, and resilience. December 28th arrived without ceremony, and the children of the slums resumed their work as if the holidays had never existed. Christmas had passed, leaving behind only the memory of warmth that had never truly reached them and food that had disappeared as quickly as it arrived. For the young, labor was not a punishment, but a necessity, the only rhythm they knew, and it demanded attention even while their bodies ached from the cold and hunger. The streets were alive with motion, though not with celebration. Small feet shuffled along alleys and narrow lanes, carrying parcels, messages, or goods to neighbors and local merchants. Some children assisted in households, helping siblings or performing chores their parents could not manage alone. Others traversed longer distances, selling matches, cleaning hearths, or fetching water from wells and pumps that had frozen overnight. Each task, though seemingly minor, carried the weight of survival. One errand missed might mean less coal, less food, less warmth. Labor was dictated by necessity, not pleasure. Children's clothing, thin and often threadbare, offered little protection against winter's chill. Hands and feet reddened quickly, fingers stiffened, and the cold gnawed at their bones. Breath rose in clouds as they moved, and the frozen air made each step heavier, each motion more deliberate. The body learned endurance through repetition. The mind learned patience and vigilance. Work demanded discipline. Adults supervised with watchful eyes, ensuring that children executed their tasks properly. Mistakes were corrected quietly but firmly. A dropped basket, a broken package, or miscounted items carried consequences, for the household relied on each contribution. Children internalized these lessons early, understanding that efficiency was survival and that misjudgment could ripple outward, affecting not only themselves but those who depended on them. Even chores that were ostensibly small carried social expectations. Selling items in the streets required poise, eyes lowered, voice measured, gestures practiced. Any sign of impatience, complaint, or fatigue might reduce the coins received or attract criticism from those nearby. Labor in the slums was never merely functional. It was also a performance, honed by years of necessity and observation. Illness and fatigue compounded the burden. Cold, hunger, and disease were constant companions, yet work could not be paused. The child who was too weak to walk to a shop, or too ill to assist at home, relied on older siblings or neighbors. But even this support was limited. Each day demanded participation, not choice. Labor was inseparable from survival, inseparable from the rhythm of the slums, and inseparable from the lessons imparted quietly through observation and expectation. By evening, children returned home, bodies stiff and fingers numb. Meals were sparse, warmth limited, and sleep awaited in spaces that offered little comfort. Blankets, when available, were shared, pressed damp and cold against skin. Yet even in rest, the mind rehearsed the work of tomorrow, tasks, errands, chores, and the careful balance of need and performance. In the Victorian slums, Christmas had offered distraction, charity, and brief warmth. But the holiday passed, as it always did. Children returned to labor with quiet obedience, understanding fully that the rhythm of survival was unbroken. Work was no longer a seasonally suspended chore. It was the constant against which all else was measured, the defining structure of childhood, and the unyielding measure of endurance in a city that demanded persistence, resilience, and care at every step. The cold lingered longer than any song or candle ever could. Christmas had passed, with its fleeting warmth, its borrowed food, and its brief displays of attention. Yet winter pressed on relentlessly, indifferent to festivity or fatigue. In the slums, cold was not a visitor. It was a permanent resident, settling into walls, floors, and bones, with the quiet patience of something that had no need to leave. Rooms that had been crowded for warmth remained crowded, but the presence of bodies offered little relief. Damp from clothing and blankets compounded the chill, and air moved sluggishly through cracks in windows and doors. Coal, when it existed, had been spent or reserved for the most critical hours. The flames that had burned for holiday gatherings had dwindled to embers, their faint heat swallowed by frost pressing inward from stone and brick. Children felt the cold first. Their small bodies, though resilient, were less able to generate or retain heat. Fingers stiffened quickly, cheeks burned bright red before fading to blue, and breath rose visibly with every movement. Lessons learned over previous weeks to huddle, to share warmth, to move deliberately were applied with efficiency. Even play was cautious, limited to motions that conserved body heat and avoided exposure to icy drafts. Adults bore the cold differently, but no less acutely. Labor resumed outside and inside, performed under vigilance against both frost and exhaustion. Clothes were layered, patched, and rationed. Hands were warmed in pockets or by proximity to others. Coal was used sparingly, and fireless rooms were endured as they always were. The cold measured every movement, shaping behavior and limiting the margin for error. The city itself seemed complicit. Streets remained grey, coated with a thin layer of frost or slush, reflecting the dull light of a pale winter sun. Snow, if it fell, hardened quickly, absorbing soot and mud, making movement difficult and offering no comfort. Chimneys belched smoke that carried briefly, then dispersed, leaving the ambient temperature unchanged. Cold was everywhere, unrelenting, and visible in the slums more sharply than anywhere else. Even meals could not mitigate the chill. Food, scarce and thin, passed through the body quickly. It warmed briefly, but energy was consumed faster than it could be restored. Hot drinks cooled immediately in rooms where fire was inadequate. Heat was fleeting, The cold returned to reclaim every surface it had been denied. Illness moved hand in hand with cold. Fevers and coughs intensified in damp rooms. Children's lungs labored under the combination of frost and fatigue. Adults coughed silently, attempting to shield weakness from others. Winter had no mercy, and celebration had done nothing to alter its course. By nightfall, the cold had entrenched itself further. Blankets, shared and damp, offered minimal protection. Floors radiated chill upward. Rooms felt smaller, darker, and heavier. Sleep came reluctantly, often in fragments, and was broken by shivering and discomfort. Morning would bring no reprieve, only continuation. In the Victorian slums, the cold did not observe the calendar. Christmas had attempted a brief interlude of warmth and relief, but the frost outlasted every indulgence. It was patient, pervasive, and absolute, reminding all who endured it that survival required vigilance, adaptation, and the quiet acceptance of discomfort, a lesson more enduring than any holiday cheer. In the slums, memory did not soften. Christmas arrived and departed like every other day, but what it left behind was not the warmth of nostalgia. It was a ledger of endurance, etched in the mind with clarity and precision. Children and adults alike remembered not the glow of candlelight or the fleeting sweetness of a gift, but the weight of cold, the sharpness of hunger, and the discipline required to navigate the season's scarce provisions. These recollections were not comforting, they were instructive. Even years later, memories of Christmas carried the texture of survival rather than celebration. The smell of coal smoke, mingled with damp blankets and human breath, returned vividly when recalled. The sound of coughing, of whispered instructions, of hurried steps through icy alleys, echoed in memory with the same urgency as the original moment. Songs from distant households, once faintly audible, became markers of inequity. The sound of joy performed elsewhere rather than experienced. These were memories not of wonder, but of observation and endurance. Children learned the lessons embedded in these recollections early. A single scrap of bread, a thin blanket, a brief moment near a fire, became monumental in retrospect. The repetition of scarcity reinforced their understanding that the world was not generous, that effort was required to survive, and that any relief was temporary. Gratitude, performance, and quiet patience were not just learned in the moment, they were embedded into memory as tools for future survival. Nostalgia, the sweetness promised by the world beyond, had no purchase here. Memory was functional, not ornamental. Adults carried similar recollections, though weighted differently. They remembered which households had provided aid and which had withheld it. They recalled the moments when children's compliance ensured the continuation of charity, and when missteps threatened to deny resources. The past was evaluated constantly against present need. Memory became a ledger, tracking debts, favors, and endurance as carefully as any written account. Christmas was never a vacation from reality. It was a set of experiences to be learned from and managed. Even acts intended as kindness, a charitable parcel, a hot meal, a moment of warmth were remembered with complexity. They were received gratefully, but their transient nature was noted immediately. Each gesture carried an implicit warning. Generosity is conditional, temporary, and never to be relied upon. The lesson, embedded in memory, was enduring. Survival required vigilance, foresight, and measured expectation. Sensory details embedded themselves stubbornly in recollection. The dampness of floorboards pressed into memory alongside the frost, the sting of wind on cheeks alongside the faint sweetness of a rare treat. The absence of warmth was as vivid as its presence could have been. These recollections did not fade into sentimentality. They remained exacting, precise, and instructive. By the time the next Christmas arrived, the memories had shaped behavior, anticipating scarcity, guiding movement, and regulating expression. Children and adults alike drew on past experience to navigate the day with measured efficiency, performing gratitude, maintaining warmth, and allocating resources with foresight. In the Victorian slums, memories were not softened by time. They did not become nostalgia for simpler or more joyful days. They existed as manuals for survival, layered with the tangible, persistent realities of cold, hunger, illness, and observation. Christmas had passed, but its lessons endured, recorded not in sentiment but in the practiced motions, disciplined routines, and watchful vigilance of those who remembered. Outside the alleys and narrow courts, Christmas was written differently. In parlours warmed by coal, in houses polished and lit, stories of the season were composed, stories that spoke of warmth, laughter, and abundance. These narratives were carefully constructed by those who had never known the slums firsthand, their imagination filling in details of hardship with sentiment, their pen softening realities that were harsh, persistent, and unrelenting. The poor, their lives lived in cold rooms and under damp blankets, rarely saw themselves reflected in these tales, except as distant ornaments in a story that was never theirs. Illustrators and writers painted streets lined with snow, glowing with lamplight and bustle. Children were depicted in clean clothing, unaccustomed to cold, with cheeks flushed by joy rather than frostbite. Tables groaned with food, often depicting every imaginable treat, from roasted meats to puddings, a vivid fantasy of plenty. These images carried weight beyond their pages. They established expectations, not for the recipients of the stories, but for the city that observed them. Wealthy readers accepted them as reality. Poor readers learned to navigate the impossibility of such abundance. The written stories emphasized morality and decorum, converting scarcity into virtue. The poor were imagined as patient, grateful, and humble, their endurance aestheticized rather than experienced. Charity was framed as both universal and redemptive. Those who gave did so freely, those who received did so gracefully. The reality of need, suffering, and constant vigilance in the slums was erased or transformed into metaphor. Hunger became a lesson in moral fortitude, cold a test of character, and disease a measure of spiritual endurance. These tales influenced perception. Neighbors within the slums internalized them cautiously, recognizing their irrelevance but understanding their social weight. Children learned that their lived experience was absent from narrative. Adults understood that society's recognition depended on performance rather than reality. Gratitude, humility, and quiet patience were not simply practical strategies, they became behaviors anticipated by a world that read stories rather than streets. Christmas itself became mythologized in these narratives. The holiday was depicted as a day of universal warmth and generosity, overlooking months of deprivation and the persistence of winter. Celebrations were imagined as harmonious, a time when need was suspended. The contrast between such tales and lived experience sharpened awareness of inequity, making the absence of joy in the slums more apparent and the brief gestures of charity more bittersweet. Observation extended beyond illustration. Sermons, poetry, and periodicals reinforced the same narratives. They claimed universality for experiences that were conditional and fleeting. The stories of Christmas in the city never acknowledged that walls were thin, beds were shared, fires were fleeting, and food was rationed. They transformed endurance into morality, suffering into allegory. Yet the people of the slums remembered the truth. Each alley, each room, each child and adult knew the rhythms of scarcity, the sharpness of frost, the persistent ache of hunger, and the exacting demands of survival. Stories written from outside, however vivid or celebrated, could not alter this reality. They existed only in print, in imagination, and in the expectations of a society that never entered the rooms they described. In the Victorian slums, Christmas was never the story told elsewhere. It was lived in cold, in hunger, and in vigilance. The tales of abundance, warmth, and cheer remained just that, tales. The people endured, observing the narratives above while navigating the unyielding reality beneath, their survival a quiet defiance against the illusions written by those who had never entered their world. In the slums, tradition was not measured by celebration or ceremony, but by endurance. Christmas, with its fleeting charity, its borrowed warmth, and its performative lessons, offered the illusion of seasonal rhythm. Yet the true continuity was not festivity, it was survival. Families, households, and children alike learned early that the passing of a day, holiday or not, demanded the same vigilance, care, and labor that had sustained them through every winter before. The day began in the familiar fashion: thin light filtering through cracks in windows, coal barely warm or entirely absent, and the pervasive chill pressing against walls and floors. Children stirred quietly, bodies stiff from nights spent huddled on cold mattresses or bare floorboards. Mothers assessed the household with practiced efficiency, ensuring that everyone had clothing sufficient to endure another day, that the youngest were attended to, that food, however meager, was divided and portioned to stretch as far as possible. Adults moved methodically, completing tasks without expectation of assistance or reprieve. Survival dictated rhythm. Meals were calculated for sustenance rather than enjoyment. Coal, water, and firewood were allocated with precision. Children performed chores, ran errands, and assisted in ways measured by necessity, not play. The cold, damp air pressed in unrelentingly, and the ill or weak required careful attention lest the household falter. Every movement, every decision, was guided by the imperative to endure. Observation reinforced survival as tradition. Neighbors watched one another, assessing diligence, compliance, and the proper management of resources. A family that failed to manage its meager provisions was visible to others, and subtle censure or comparison ensured that the lessons of survival were reinforced. Even small acts, such as sharing a scrap of coal or a portion of food, became opportunities to practice endurance alongside others, teaching the young that cooperation, careful judgment, and quiet discretion were essential for continued existence. Illness, hunger, and fatigue never ceased. Winter made each day sharper, and cold penetrated even the thinnest layer of clothing. Sickness moved silently from body to body, unaltered by calendar, faith, or fleeting charity. Every cough, shiver, and whimper reminded the household of the fragility of life. Survival required constant attention, the careful measurement of warmth, the administration of scarce food, and the careful observation of symptoms that could not be ignored. Christmas offered no suspension of these realities. Even memory reinforced the tradition. Children internalized the patterns, recognizing that celebrations were ephemeral, that gifts and charity were fleeting, and that only endurance could be relied upon. Lessons in gratitude, patience, and obedience were intertwined with the practices of survival. By observing adults, performing their duties, and moderating their own needs, children learned the unspoken rules of persistence. These lessons, repeated yearly, became embedded as a cultural practice more enduring than any festivity. By nightfall, the household settled again into its sparse accommodations. Floors radiated cold, blankets remained damp, and bodies pressed close for minimal warmth. Sleep, when it came, was brief and fractured, yet necessary to confront another day with similar demands. Christmas had passed without altering the underlying patterns. The rituals of survival continued, unbroken and absolute. In the Victorian slums, survival was the only tradition. It did not depend on candles, songs, or seasonal charity. It depended on diligence, cooperation, observation, and endurance practiced daily, repeated yearly, and transmitted quietly from generation to generation. In this reality, the holiday season was no more than an interlude. Survival itself was the rhythm by which lives were measured, and the lesson that endured far longer than any fleeting celebration. The bells had rung and faded, leaving only echoes in the streets, muted by narrow alleys and the thick winter air. In wealthier districts, the sound had been a proclamation of joy, a signal of communal celebration, of abundance observed and shared. In the slums, it marked the passing of another day in which nothing had changed, except the reminder that the world beyond remained indifferent. Silence followed, not as peace, but as observation, a quiet pressure that pressed into every room, every corner, every body. Children listened first. They had been trained to attend to sound as carefully as adults, for the noise of carriages, footsteps, or falling snow carried information. Who was moving, who was watching, who had arrived, who had left. The bells offered no guidance. They simply marked the passage of time. The silence after them was far heavier than their brief resonance. It pressed against ears and chest alike, demanding awareness, discipline, and quiet patience. Adults moved with precision in response. Chores were resumed methodically. Water was drawn from pumps, meals prepared with measured efficiency, and coal rationed for the next night. Every motion was framed by the knowledge that the world beyond had returned to its own rhythms, and that no extra measure of warmth, food, or attention would arrive. The bells had announced nothing tangible. Their echo had faded, leaving only the same cold, the same hunger, and the same duties. Illness continued unabated. Tuberculosis, coughs, and fever persisted without acknowledgement from outside observers. The silence after the bells amplified every sound within the room. A cough, a shift in weight, the sigh of fatigue. These noises became amplified markers of vulnerability. Children and adults alike moved cautiously, avoiding disturbance, conserving energy, and preserving the fragile order of shared space. The absence of festive sound emphasized contrasts that the slums already understood. Windows of distant houses glowed with warmth and color, untainted by want. Laughter and music from elsewhere reminded the residents that joy could exist without them, and that abundance was as invisible as it was unattainable. The silence left in the wake of the bells made this truth sharper. It was not threatening, it was constant and unavoidable. Survival dictated the next steps. Children returned to chores, quietly performing errands or tending siblings. Adults checked on the sick, allocated food, and prepared for the night ahead. The rhythm of endurance continued without interruption, unmarked by celebration or holiday, unaltered by transient gestures of charity. Silence reinforced the practice of self-reliance, of discipline, of observing the needs of body and household without expectation of external relief. By evening, the slums had settled again into their customary hush. Coal embers glowed faintly where fires had been lit sparingly. Blankets were shared and pressed close to bodies. Hunger, fatigue, and cold were as present as ever, pressing down in unison. The bells were long gone, and the silence that followed carried a weight heavier than sound itself, reminding everyone of their own endurance and the impermanence of attention. In the Victorian slums, the silence after the bells was not empty. It was instructive, persistent, and inescapable. It marked the end of observation, the return to routine, and the continuation of life lived under relentless pressure. Christmas, with all its songs and charity, had passed. The silence remained, heavy, absolute, and unwavering, the true measure of winter and survival. The season ended as it had begun, with cold that settled into every crack, every floorboard, every layer of thin clothing pressed close to skin. Christmas, celebrated elsewhere with song, light, and warmth, had passed through the slums like a distant echo. For those who lived here, the season had exposed nothing new about the world. It revealed instead the enduring truth of their existence, that life demanded endurance, observation, and constant vigilance, and that relief was never permanent, only temporary, and often conditional. Morning light, pale and weak, fell through cracks in windows, revealing floors damp from frost and walls streaked with the condensation of shared breath. Children stirred quietly, bodies stiff from nights spent, huddled on mattresses or the bare floor. Hunger sharpened alongside the cold, pressing into bellies that had been fed only minimally, while adults moved methodically through familiar routines, ensuring that every ounce of effort yielded the maximum return for survival. The season had done nothing to change these realities. It had only highlighted them. The lessons of Christmas had been subtle but relentless. Charity had come, always limited, observed carefully, and often fleeting. Gifts had arrived only to disappear. Warmth had been borrowed and brief, and attention had been offered conditionally. Children had learned the choreography of gratitude, the performance of patience, the careful regulation of desire. Adults had reinforced order, moderated expectations, and ensured survival above all else. The slums had absorbed these lessons quietly, and their imprint endured long after the bells had ceased and visitors had departed. Outside, the contrast with wealth remained stark. Streets lined with light and warmth showcased abundance in a way that could only be observed and never possessed. Carriages rolled, carols drifted, and windows glowed in patterns that highlighted what was lacking rather than what was gained. The season, in its idealized form, existed elsewhere. Within the slums, it existed as a series of ephemeral interventions, reminders of disparity and the limitations of generosity. The air itself carried these truths. Coal smoke lingered in rooms that had barely seen fire, damp from blankets and walls pressed into clothing, reinforcing the ever-present chill. Human breath, shared closely, carried illness, fatigue, and tension. Sound was measured and careful, for noise attracted attention but could not alter circumstance. Hunger, cold, and disease persisted, patient and unyielding. The season had passed, but it had left these constants intact. By evening, rooms were arranged once more for survival. Blankets layered, bodies pressed close for minimal warmth, and the routine of tending the weak, dividing food, and conserving energy resumed with quiet efficiency. The festive decorations, however few or symbolic, had been removed, leaving the spaces stark and unadorned. Charity, when it had come, was gone. Observation had ended. Only endurance remained. The season exposed the enduring hierarchy of the city. Generosity had been selective, attention fleeting, and relief conditional. Scarcity remained the defining metric of life, and the performance of survival was required every day, not just during holidays. Children absorbed this understanding early, adults enforced it continuously, and the community, collectively, had adapted to it fully. In the Victorian slums, Christmas revealed nothing that had not already been known. It was a mirror held briefly against existence, reflecting the realities of hunger, cold, illness, and observation with stark clarity. The season ended, leaving behind its lessons. Survival was unbroken, relief was transient, and the endurance of the human body and spirit remained the only constant. Here, amidst damp floors, thin blankets, and shared breath, the truth of life in the slums had been exposed unyielding, persistent, and absolute.